She lied about her qualifications out of desperation, but when the truth came out... Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. You have 30 days. The words hit Frances Johnson like a physical blow as she stared at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. 30 days. The paper felt heavier than it should, each typed letter a small nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed life. Mom. Tyler's voice drifted from the kitchen, where he sat hunched over his algebra homework, his 14-year-old frame too thin, too serious for his age. Everything okay? Frances quickly folded the notice, shoving it deep into her purse where it couldn't hurt anyone else. Not yet. Just some paperwork, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about. But everything was worth worrying about. 6 months. 6 months since the downsizing at Morrison Industries had left her scrambling for work, watching their small savings evaporate like morning dew. 6 months of rejection letters, overqualified for some positions, underqualified for others, caught in that impossible middle ground of being 38 with experience but no college degree. She moved to the kitchen window, watching the October sun cast long shadows across their tiny backyard. The mortgage payment was already 3 months behind. The utilities were on final notice, and yesterday had been the worst blow of all. "Frances, honey!" Her mother Dorothy's voice echoed in her memory from their phone call that morning. Frail, apologetic, devastating. "The pharmacy says my insulin went up again. It's $340 now. I tried to ask them about payment plans, but $340. Frances had exactly $73 in her checking account. "Mom, are you sure you finished your homework?" Frances asked, needing to focus on something, anything, other than the mathematics of their impossible situation. Tyler looked up, his dark eyes so much like his grandfather Bobby's, filled with that same steady intelligence that had made her father the best mechanic in 3 counties before the accident took him away 15 years ago. "Yeah, it's done. You look tired." Tired. Such a small word for such an enormous feeling. Frances was beyond tired. She was drowning, and the shore seemed to be getting further away with each passing day. "Just thinking about tomorrow," she said, which was true enough. Tomorrow she had another interview, her last real shot before what? She couldn't think about that. "Want me to heat up the leftover pasta?" Tyler offered, already standing. Always taking care of her, this boy who should be worrying about homework and friends and whether Jenny Matthews from his history class noticed him. "That would be wonderful, honey." As Tyler moved around their small kitchen with practiced efficiency, Frances pulled out her phone and scrolled through the job listings one more time. Administrative assistant positions, all requiring degrees she didn't have, experience with software she'd never used, references from jobs that had vanished in corporate restructuring. Then she saw it, a posting that hadn't been there this morning. Senior Administrative Assistant, Helios Corporation, renewable energy company seeks experienced professional for executive support role. Competitive salary, full benefits, immediate start available for right candidate. Frances's finger hovered over the link. Helios Corporation. She'd heard of them, the solar energy company that had been in the news for their innovative turbine designs. Clean energy for a better tomorrow. The kind of company that made her believe there might still be good people doing good work in the world. She clicked the link, and her heart sank immediately. Bachelor's degree required. 5 years of experience in renewable energy sector preferred. Proficiency in advanced project management software. References from senior executives in related industries. Frances had none of these things. She had a high school diploma, 15 years of administrative work at companies that no longer existed, and a reference from her last supervisor who'd been laid off the same day she was. "Smells good," she said as Tyler set a plate of reheated pasta in front of her, the simple kindness of the gesture threatening to break her composure entirely. "Mom," Tyler said quietly, sitting across from her with his own plate. "I've been thinking. Maybe I could get a job after school. Jenny's older brother works at the grocery store, and they're always looking for—" "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than she intended. Tyler's face fell, and Frances immediately softened her tone. "Sweetheart, your job is school. That's the only job I want you thinking about." But as they ate in companionable silence, Frances's mind wandered back to the Helios posting. Senior administrative assistant, $45,000 a year, health insurance, dental, vision. The holy trinity of benefits that could transform their lives overnight. She looked at Tyler, bent over his pasta, probably calculating in his head how they could make their food budget stretch another week. She thought about her mother, rationing insulin because the alternative was asking her daughter for money she didn't have. She thought about the eviction notice burning a hole in her purse. After Tyler went to bed, Frances sat at their second-hand laptop, the Helios Corporation website glowing in the darkness. She read about their mission, their commitment to sustainable energy, their innovative approaches to environmental challenges. She read about their CEO, Elijah Bennett, a 40-year-old visionary who'd left a lucrative position at a traditional energy company to pursue his dream of clean power for everyone, the kind of man who probably never had to choose between groceries and medicine. The kind of man who'd never understand what it meant to lie awake at 3 a.m, calculating and recalculating impossible numbers, but the kind of man, perhaps, who might value determination over credentials, who might see potential where others saw only limitations. Frances stared at the application portal for a long time, her cursor blinking in the empty fields like a heartbeat. Name, address, education, employment, history. She thought about Tyler's 2 serious eyes, about her mother's apologetic voice, about 30 days and counting. She began to type. The call came at 8:37 the next morning, just as Frances was getting Tyler ready for school. "Ms. Johnson, this is Maya Santos from Helios Corporation. Mr. Bennett would like to schedule an interview with you for this afternoon if you're available." Frances's hand tightened on the phone. "This afternoon would be perfect. Wonderful. 2 o'clock at our downtown office. Do you know the Meridian Building?" The Meridian Building, glass and steel reaching toward the sky, the kind of place where successful people made important decisions, the kind of place Frances had never belonged. "Yes, I can find it. Excellent. Mr. Bennett is looking forward to meeting you. Your application was quite impressive." After hanging up, Frances stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Quite impressive. The words should have filled her with pride, but instead they sat heavy in her stomach like stones. Because impressive was not the word she would have used for what she'd submitted the night before. Creative, perhaps. Desperate, certainly. But impressive. She'd taken her 15 years of real administrative work and dressed it up in language borrowed from job postings and corporate websites. She'd transformed her stint as office manager at a failed startup into senior operations coordinator for innovative technology firm. Her experience with basic bookkeeping software became advanced proficiency in integrated financial management systems. Each embellishment had felt necessary, justified by the pressing weight of their circumstances. After all, she could do the job. She was smart, adaptable, hard-working. The lies were just translation. Making her real qualifications speak the language that human resources departments understood. "Mom, you okay?" Tyler appeared in the bathroom doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just nervous about an interview today." "Interview?" His face lit up with hope so pure it made her chest ache. "That's amazing. Where?" "A renewable energy company. Solar power technology. Like saving the planet stuff. Exactly like saving the planet stuff. Tyler grinned, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. That's so cool, Mum. You're gonna nail it. As she walked him to the bus stop, Frances tried to absorb some of his confidence, but the weight of what she'd done, what she was about to do, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. At the bus stop, Tyler turned to her with those serious dark eyes. Mom, whatever happens today, you know you're the smartest person I know, right? The statement was so matter-of-fact, so filled with absolute faith, that Frances had to blink back tears. I love you, kiddo. Love you too. Now go show them what Dorothy Johnson's daughter is made of. Dorothy Johnson's daughter. Frances smiled despite herself. Her mother had raised her to believe that character mattered more than credentials, that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Dorothy had married Bobby Johnson when he was just 20, and she was 32, seeing something in the young mechanic that others missed. Their love story had been the stuff of small-town legend, proving that worth wasn't measured by conventional standards. But Dorothy had never had to fabricate a resume to feed her family. As the bus pulled away and Tyler waved from his window, Frances made a silent promise. This interview would change everything. She would make sure of it. Back home, she spent 2 hours researching everything she could find about Helios Corporation, their innovative turbine designs, their commitment to environmental sustainability, their rapid growth in the renewable energy sector. She memorized the names of their major projects, their key partnerships, their mission statement. By the time she selected her most professional outfit, a navy blazer and grey slacks that had seen better days but still looked respectable, Frances felt almost ready, almost confident, almost honest. She caught her reflection one more time before leaving, seeing her father's determined jawline, her mother's resilient eyes. Dorothy Johnson's daughter, indeed. But as she drove toward downtown, toward the Meridian Building and Elijah Bennett and the interview that could save them all, Frances couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving toward something much more complicated than a simple job interview. She was driving toward a line she'd never crossed before, a line between the woman she'd always been and the woman desperate circumstances were forcing her to become. At exactly 1:55, Frances Johnson walked through the glass doors of the Meridian Building, her fabricated resume clutched in her sweating palm, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt like a journey to another world entirely. Mrs. Johnson. Frances looked up from the sleek waiting area where she'd been admiring the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. A young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached, extending her hand. I'm Maya Santos, Mr. Bennett's assistant. Thank you for coming in on such short notice. Thank you for the opportunity, Frances replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. As Maya led her through an open office space, filled with natural light and the quiet hum of productive activity, Frances caught glimpses of the future she desperately wanted to be part of. Engineers bent over computer screens showing three-dimensional turbine designs. Marketing professionals discussing campaign strategies for clean energy initiatives. Everyone moving with the purposeful energy of people who believed their work mattered. Mr. Bennett is just finishing up a call, Maya said, pausing outside a glass-walled office. He should be ready in just a moment. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Water would be wonderful, thank you. Through the glass, Frances could see him. Elijah Bennett looked younger than his 40 years, with dark hair that suggested he ran his fingers through it when he was thinking, and eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. He was on the phone, but his attention kept drifting to a tablet where he was sketching something with quick, confident strokes. He's always drawing, Maya said, noticing Frances's gaze. New ideas, improvements to existing designs. He says his best thinking happens when his hands are moving. There was genuine affection in Maya's voice. the kind that came from working for someone you truly respected. Frances felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months, hope that this might be more than just a job. "Miss Johnson." Elijah Bennett's voice was warm as he opened his office door. "Please come in. I apologize for keeping you waiting." As Frances stepped into his office, she was struck by how different it felt from the sterile corporate environment she'd known before. Books on renewable energy lined one wall, while another displayed photographs of wind farms and solar installations from around the world. His desk was cluttered with the controlled chaos of someone who had too many ideas and not quite enough time to pursue them all. "Please have a seat," Elijah said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "I have to say, your resume caught my attention immediately. Your experience with integrated systems management is exactly what we need for our upcoming expansion." Frances felt her stomach clench. Integrated systems management, the phrase she'd lifted directly from another job posting and inserted into her fabricated experience. "Thank you. I've always been drawn to challenges that require coordination across multiple platforms." It wasn't technically a lie. She had coordinated multiple platforms during her years of administrative work, even if those platforms were more about scheduling and filing than advanced technological systems. "Tell me about your work with renewable energy logistics," Elijah continued, his eyes bright with genuine interest. "I'm particularly curious about how you approached supply chain optimization in your previous role." Supply chain optimization. Frances's mind raced. She thought about her real experience, the countless hours she'd spent coordinating deliveries and managing vendor relationships at her previous jobs. The principles were the same, weren't they? Just scaled up. "In my experience," she began carefully, "the key is understanding that every component in the chain affects every other component. When you're working with renewable energy projects, timing becomes critical. A delay in one area can cascade through the entire timeline." Elijah nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. That's what so many people don't understand about this industry. It's not just about the technology. It's about the human systems that make the technology possible." For the next 20 minutes, they talked about logistics, about coordination challenges, about the importance of communication between different departments. Frances found herself relaxing despite her deception, because underneath the inflated language of her resume, she did understand these concepts. She'd been solving coordination problems her entire career, just on a smaller scale. "I'm impressed," Elijah said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Your approach to problem-solving seems very intuitive, practical. We get a lot of candidates with impressive credentials, but no real understanding of how things actually work in practice." The irony was not lost on Frances. Here was a man praising her for having practical understanding, while she sat across from him with a resume full of theoretical credentials she'd never earned. "I've always believed that the best solutions come from understanding the real world, not just the theoretical one," she said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said all day. "That's refreshing to hear." Elijah picked up his tablet and made a few notes. "The position involves supporting our executive team, but it's not traditional administrative work. We need someone who can anticipate problems, coordinate between departments, and help us stay ahead of the rapid changes in this industry. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in?" Interested? Frances would have cleaned bathrooms if it meant providing stability for Tyler and her mother. But this sounded like work that might actually fulfill her, work that might make a difference. "It sounds perfect," she said. "Excellent." Elijah stood up, extending his hand. "I'd like to offer you the position, Ms. Johnson. When would you be available to start?" Frances stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry." "The job, it's yours if you want it. 45,000 to start, full benefits, 2 weeks paid vacation. I know it's quick, but I've learned to trust my instincts." and my instincts say you're exactly what we need here." The room seemed to spin slightly. 6 months of rejection, 6 months of watching their world crumble around them, and now this man was offering her salvation based on a 20-minute conversation and a fabricated resume. Yes, absolutely. When would you like me to start? How about Monday morning? Maya can handle the paperwork and show you around. Welcome to Helios Corporation, Francis. As they shook hands, Francis felt the weight of 30 days evaporating, replaced by something equally heavy but infinitely more complex: guilt, relief, terror, hope. Walking back through the open office space, past all those purposeful, committed faces, Francis realized she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for. The question now was whether she could live with how she'd gotten it. "Congratulations," Maya said as she walked Francis to the elevator. "Mr. Bennett doesn't usually make decisions that quickly, but when he does, it means he's really excited about someone. I think you're going to fit in wonderfully here." In the elevator, descending from the 23rd floor back to ground level, Francis caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked the same as she had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just Frances Johnson, struggling single mother. She was Frances Johnson, Senior Administrative Assistant at Helios Corporation. The title felt both thrilling and terrifying. As she stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, Frances pulled out her phone to call Tyler, to share the good news, to let him know that everything was going to be okay now. But as she dialed his number, one thought echoed in her mind with crystal clarity. She'd gotten the job through deception, but now she'd have to keep it through competence. The question was whether competence would be enough to justify the lie that had made it all possible. "Mom, this is incredible!" Tyler's voice crackled with excitement through the phone as Frances sat in her car in the Helios Corporation parking lot, still trying to process what had just happened. 45,000. That's more than Dad ever made, isn't it? Francis winced slightly. Tyler rarely mentioned his father, Mark Morrison, the man who disappeared when pregnancy tests became reality and responsibility became more than just theoretical. But Tyler was right about the money. It was more than Mark had ever contributed to their lives, which wasn't saying much. "It's a good salary, sweetheart. It means we can stay in the house. It means Grandma Dorothy can get her medication without worry. And maybe you can stop looking so scared all the time." The observation hit Francis like a gentle punch to the chest. Had she really been carrying her fear so openly that her 14-year-old son had noticed? Of course he had. Tyler noticed everything, just like his grandfather Bobby used to. "Maybe," she said softly. After hanging up, Francis sat in the parking lot for another few minutes, watching the late afternoon sun reflect off the Meridian building's glass facade. Inside, Elijah Bennett was probably already thinking about how to integrate her into his team, making plans based on capabilities she'd claimed to possess but had never actually demonstrated. The drive home took her through neighborhoods that told the story of their city's economic evolution. Past the shuttered factories where her father had once repaired machinery, through the struggling downtown core where empty storefronts stood like missing teeth, and finally into her own neighborhood, where modest houses held families doing their best to maintain dignity in the face of an economy that seemed to have forgotten they existed. Her house sat on Maple Street, a 1950s ranch-style home that had been her childhood haven and was now her adult burden. The mortgage payments that had seemed manageable when she'd first inherited it after her father's death now felt like a monthly mountain to climb. But not anymore. Not after Monday. "Francis! That you, honey?" Dorothy's voice called from the kitchen as Francis entered through the side door. Her mother was there most afternoons now, having given up her own small apartment 6 months ago when the combination of Francis's job loss and her increasing medical expenses made it impossible for either of them to maintain separate households. "It's me, Mama, and I have news." Dorothy looked up from where she was preparing what appeared to be dinner for three, saw her 72-year-old hands moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd been feeding people for most of her life. Despite her diabetes, despite the stress of their financial situation, Dorothy Johnson still possessed the quiet dignity that had made Frances proud to be her daughter. "Good news or complicated news?" Dorothy asked, because she knew her daughter well enough to recognize that the two weren't always mutually exclusive. "Good news. Definitely good news. I got the job." Dorothy's face lit up with pure relief and pride. "Oh, Frances, honey, that's wonderful. Tell me everything." As Frances described the interview, the office, Elijah Bennett's immediate offer, she found herself editing slightly. Not lying, exactly, but emphasizing certain aspects while downplaying others. She talked about Bennett's vision for renewable energy, about the company's growth, about the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. She didn't talk about the fabricated resume or the credentials she'd claimed but didn't possess. "He sounds like a good man," Dorothy said, stirring something that smelled like her famous beef stew. "Your father would have liked him, I think. Bobby always said the measure of a person was whether they were trying to build something or tear something down." Frances felt a familiar pang at the mention of her father. Bobby Johnson had been a man of absolute integrity, someone who'd never told a lie when the truth would serve, no matter how difficult that truth might be. What would he think of what she'd done today? "The salary is enough to cover everything," Frances continued, pushing the uncomfortable thoughts aside. "The house, your medication, Tyler's school expenses, we're going to be okay, Mama." Dorothy studied her daughter's face with eyes that had seen 7 decades of human complexity. "That's a relief, honey. But are you okay? You look a little unsettled." Before Frances could answer, Tyler burst through the front door with the kind of energy only teenagers could muster. "Mom, I told everyone at school about your new job. Mrs. Henderson says Helios Corporation is like the most innovative company in the state. She says they're literally saving the planet." "Well, I don't know about literally saving the planet," Frances laughed, but she felt a warm glow at Tyler's obvious pride. Over dinner, they made plans, real plans, for the first time in months. Tyler could sign up for the robotics club he'd been interested in, but they couldn't afford. Dorothy could schedule the specialist appointment she'd been postponing. Frances could buy work clothes that weren't borrowed from her limited wardrobe of interview outfits. "You know what this means," Tyler said, brandishing his fork dramatically. "We can actually go to the movies again, like regular people." "We were always regular people," Dorothy said gently. "Money doesn't make you regular or irregular. Character does." Character. The word hung in the air like a small challenge. Frances helped clear the dishes, her mind churning with the implications of her grandmother's simple statement. Later that evening, after Dorothy had retired to her room and Tyler was absorbed in his homework, Frances sat at her laptop researching everything she could find about Helios Corporation and renewable energy technology. If she was going to keep this job, she needed to transform her fabricated expertise into real knowledge as quickly as possible. She read about photovoltaic systems and wind turbine efficiency. She studied organizational charts and project timelines. She memorized the names and backgrounds of key personnel, trying to build a foundation of legitimate understanding beneath the shaky structure of her deception. By 11 o'clock, her eyes were burning and her head was spinning with new information, but she'd also begun to feel something she hadn't expected, genuine excitement about the work itself. The technology was fascinating. The environmental mission was compelling, and the complexity of coordinating large-scale renewable energy projects seemed like exactly the kind of challenge that would engage all her problem-solving instincts. Maybe, she thought as she finally closed the laptop, she could grow into the role she'd claimed to be qualified for. Maybe competence could eventually justify the deception that had made the opportunity possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya Santos. "Looking forward to working with you on Monday. Mr. Bennett asked me to send you some reading materials to help you get up to speed. Hope you're as excited as we are." Attached were links to company reports, industry analyses, and project specifications that made Frances's evening of research look like elementary homework. She was in deep water now, deeper than she'd realized when she'd first clicked submit on that fabricated resume. But Tyler's excited chatter about robotics clubs and Dorothy's visible relief about medical expenses reminded her why she'd jumped into these waters in the first place. Some risks were worth taking. Some lies served a greater truth. At least, that's what she told herself as she finally turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep, her mind still churning with photovoltaic specifications and the memory of Elijah Bennett's trusting smile. Monday morning would come whether she was ready or not. The question was whether Frances Johnson, Senior Administrative Assistant 1, could live up to the expectations that Frances Johnson, desperate mother, had created. Monday morning arrived with the cruel punctuality of deadlines and new beginnings. Frances stood in front of her bedroom mirror at 6:30, adjusting her navy blazer for the third time and trying to convince herself that she looked like someone who belonged in the 23rd floor of the Meridian building. "You look professional," Tyler announced from her doorway. His own school clothes rumpled from sleep, but his eyes bright with encouragement, like someone who's about to save the planet. "I'm just going to help coordinate some projects, sweetheart. Let's not get carried away." But even as she said it, Frances felt a flutter of anticipation beneath her nervousness. She'd spent the weekend immersed in renewable energy research, and the more she'd learned about Helios Corporation's work, the more genuinely excited she'd become about being part of it. "Your father would be proud," Dorothy said, appearing with a travel mug of coffee and a brown bag that undoubtedly contained enough lunch for 2 people. "Bobby always said the best jobs were the ones that made the world a little better than you found it." Frances accepted the coffee and lunch with gratitude, but her father's memory also brought a familiar twist of guilt. Bobby Johnson had been scrupulously honest, the kind of man who'd drive back to return extra change from a grocery store clerk. What would he think of his daughter's fabricated credentials? The drive to downtown took 22 minutes, giving Frances just enough time to review the mental notes she'd made about Helios Corporation's current projects and key personnel. By the time she parked in the visitors section of the Meridian Building's garage, she'd almost convinced herself that enthusiasm and quick learning could compensate for the gaps in her actual experience. Maya Santos was waiting in the lobby with a genuine smile and a manila folder thick with orientation materials. "Welcome to your first day. Mr. Bennett is in meetings all morning, but I thought we'd start with the official tour and paperwork. Then I can introduce you to the team." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of forms, explanations, and introductions. Frances met the engineering team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant woman who spoke about turbine efficiency with the passion most people reserved for discussing their children. She met the marketing department, currently wrestling with how to communicate complex technological benefits to potential clients who weren't engineers themselves. She met the finance team, including Arthur Wood, whose handshake was firm, but whose eyes seemed to linger on her face just a moment longer than necessary. "Ms. Johnson," Arthur said, his voice professionally pleasant but somehow cautious. "Maya tells me you'll be supporting the executive team. What's your background in renewable energy?" Frances felt her first real test arriving faster than she'd hoped. "I've worked primarily in operations coordination," she said carefully, making sure different departments communicate effectively, anticipating logistical challenges, that sort of thing. "I find that the principles are pretty universal, regardless of the specific industry." "Interesting perspective," Arthur replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "We'll have to compare notes sometime. I'm always curious about different operational approaches. As Maya led her away from the finance department, Frances caught herself glancing back at Arthur Wood. Something in his manner suggested a man who paid attention to details, who might be the type to ask uncomfortable questions about backgrounds and qualifications. "Don't mind Arthur," Maya said quietly as they walked toward Frances's new workstation. "He's brilliant with numbers, but he can be a bit intense. Takes a while to warm up to new people." Frances's desk was positioned strategically between Maya's workspace and Elijah Bennett's glass-walled office, with a clear view of the main work area where most of the company's daily activities unfolded. It was, she realized, a position that would require her to understand everything that was happening throughout the organization. "Mr. Bennett likes his assistants to be plugged into all aspects of the business," Maya explained, as if reading her thoughts. "He says the best administrative support comes from people who understand the big picture, not just their specific tasks." Understanding the big picture. Frances felt both excited and terrified by the prospect. She'd always been good at seeing connections, at anticipating problems before they became crises. But those skills had been developed in much smaller organizations, with much simpler challenges. "Frances!" Elijah Bennett's voice carried across the office as he emerged from a conference room with 3 other people who looked like they'd been having an intense technical discussion. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to sit in on our project review meeting this afternoon. It'll be a good introduction to how we coordinate between departments." Project review meeting. Frances nodded confidently, while her internal voice whispered warnings about getting in over her head too quickly. "Of course. Maya's been giving me an overview of current projects. I'm looking forward to seeing how everything fits together." "Excellent. 2 o'clock in conference room B. Maya can fill you in on the background beforehand." As Elijah disappeared back into his office, Maya turned to Frances with an apologetic smile. "I should warn you, these project reviews can be pretty technical. Don't worry if you don't follow everything at first. It takes a while to get up to speed on all the engineering details." Frances spent her lunch break studying the project files Maya had provided, trying to absorb as much context as possible before the afternoon meeting. The current focus was on a new turbine design that promised to increase energy efficiency by 15% while reducing manufacturing costs. The engineering team had been working on it for 8 months, but they were running into coordination challenges between the design phase and the manufacturing specifications. Coordination challenges. Frances felt a spark of recognition. She'd spent years dealing with coordination challenges, just in different contexts. The principles were the same: communication breakdowns, timeline conflicts, resource allocation problems. Maybe her experience was more relevant than she'd realized. At exactly 2 o'clock, Frances walked into conference room B with a notepad and what she hoped was an expression of competent attentiveness. The room was already filled with department heads, engineers, and project managers, all looking slightly weary in the way that suggested this particular coordination challenge had been ongoing for some time. "All right, everyone," Elijah began, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Let's see where we stand with the Mark 7 turbine project. Sarah, want to start with the engineering update." For the next hour, Frances listened to a detailed discussion of technical specifications, manufacturing tolerances, supply chain logistics, and timeline pressures. Much of the engineering detail went over her head, but the organizational dynamics were entirely familiar. Different departments working with different priorities, communication gaps creating inefficiencies, small problems cascading into larger ones because no one had a complete view of the whole system. "The real issue," Dr. Chen was saying, "is that manufacturing keeps requesting design modifications based on their equipment limitations, but those modifications affect our performance calculations. We need better coordination between design and production." And marketing needs final specifications so we can develop client presentations, added James Rivera from the marketing team. We can't keep telling potential customers approximately 15% improvement when they want exact numbers. Frances found herself taking notes not just on what people were saying, but on what they weren't saying. The frustration in Dr. Chen's voice when manufacturing requested another design change. The way the marketing team exchanged glances when engineering timelines were discussed. The small signs of interdepartmental tension that she recognized from every organization she'd ever worked in. What if we approached this differently? She heard herself saying before she'd consciously decided to speak. The room fell quiet. Everyone turned to look at her, and Frances felt her heart rate accelerate. But she was committed now. She continued, trying to keep her voice steady. It sounds like the core issue is that each department is optimizing for their own priorities without a clear view of how their decisions affect everyone else. What if we created a shared tracking system where manufacturing constraints, engineering specifications, and marketing requirements were all visible to everyone simultaneously? Elijah leaned forward, his expression interested. Go on. Well, instead of manufacturing requesting design changes after the engineering is complete, they could flag potential issues during the design phase. Marketing could see exactly how specification changes affect performance claims in real time. Everyone would be working from the same information simultaneously, instead of passing requirements back and forth sequentially. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That could work. We'd need to structure the information flow carefully, but the concept makes sense. It's not revolutionary technology, Frances continued, feeling more confident as she spoke. Most of the tools already exist. We'd just need to set up better communication protocols and shared visibility. Interesting, Arthur Wood said from across the table, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. What kind of systems have you used for that type of coordination in your previous roles? Frances felt the familiar clench of anxiety in her stomach. Well, the specific software varied depending on the organization, but the principles are pretty universal. Clear information architecture, defined communication protocols, shared accountability for outcomes rather than just individual tasks. It wasn't exactly an answer, but it wasn't exactly evasion either. And apparently it was sufficient, because Elijah was already turning to Maya with instructions about setting up a follow-up meeting to explore implementation details. Excellent suggestion, Frances, Elijah said as the meeting concluded. I had a feeling your operational perspective would be valuable. Maya, can you work with Frances to put together a proposal for how we might structure this kind of integrated tracking system? Walking back to her desk, Frances felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. She'd made a genuinely useful contribution to the meeting, which proved that her instincts about organizational coordination were sound. But she'd also positioned herself as someone with expertise in systems implementation, which was stretching her actual experience considerably. That was impressive, Maya said as they settled back at their desks. Mr. Bennett loves it when people can see solutions that cross departmental boundaries. Most people get stuck thinking about their own piece of the puzzle. Frances smiled, accepting the compliment while internally calculating how quickly she could educate herself about project management systems and coordination software. She had the weekend to figure out how to transform her theoretical suggestions into practical implementation plans. As the day wound down, she found herself reviewing her notes from the meeting and researching coordination software options online. Despite the anxiety of being in over her head, she felt genuinely engaged with the work in a way she hadn't experienced in years. This was exactly the kind of problem-solving that energized her, the kind of work that felt meaningful. Frances, Elijah's voice came from behind her as she was preparing to leave. Do you have a minute? She turned to find him standing by her desk, his expression thoughtful. "Of course. I wanted to thank you for today. Your perspective in that meeting was exactly what we needed. Sometimes it takes someone with fresh eyes to see solutions that the rest of us have been missing. I'm glad I could contribute something useful." "I have a feeling you're going to contribute quite a lot," Elijah said, and there was something in his tone that made Francis look at him more carefully. Professional appreciation, certainly, but something warmer underneath. "I'm looking forward to working with you." As he walked away, Francis felt a different kind of flutter in her chest. Not just professional pride, but something more personal. Something that had nothing to do with job security or financial stability. Something that made the fabricated resume feel like an even heavier burden than before. Because lying to an employer was one thing, but lying to someone you might be starting to care about, that was something else entirely. Over the next 3 weeks, Frances found herself settling into a rhythm at Helios Corporation that felt both natural and surreal. Her mornings began with reviewing project updates and coordinating between departments, tasks that drew on skills she'd been developing for 15 years. But her afternoons often involved technical discussions that required her to think quickly, translate complex concepts, and contribute insights that somehow managed to be both genuine and slightly beyond her actual expertise. "Francis, do you have a minute?" Dr. Sarah Chen appeared at her desk on a Tuesday morning, carrying a tablet loaded with turbine specifications. "I wanted to get your thoughts on the manufacturing timeline for the Mark 7 project." 3 weeks ago, Francis would have panicked at such a request. Now, she simply nodded and followed Sarah to one of the small conference rooms that dotted the Helios office space. "The problem is coordination," Sarah continued, settling into a chair across from Francis. "Manufacturing says they need 6 weeks to retool for the new specifications, but marketing has already promised delivery to our pilot customer in 4 weeks. Francis studied the timeline Sarah showed her, recognizing a familiar pattern. What if we staged the manufacturing transition, start retooling for the most critical components immediately, while running final tests on the less complex parts using current equipment? Sarah's eyes lit up. That could work. We'd need to be very careful about quality control, but it would give us the extra time we need. She paused, looking at Francis with newfound respect. You have a real talent for seeing practical solutions. Where did you develop that kind of systems thinking? The question that Francis had been dreading for 3 weeks, asked with genuine professional curiosity by someone she was genuinely beginning to like and respect. Experience? Mostly, Francis said carefully. I've found that most coordination problems have similar underlying structures, regardless of the specific industry. It's about understanding how different moving parts affect each other. It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it also wasn't the complete truth that Sarah deserved. Well, your experience is exactly what we needed, Sarah said, standing to leave. I'm going to present your staging idea to the full team this afternoon. Thank you. As Sarah walked away, Francis felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that had become her constant companion. Pride because her suggestions were genuinely helpful. Anxiety because each success raised the stakes of her deception a little higher. Francis, Maya's voice interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Bennett asked if you could join him for lunch today. He wants to discuss the new project tracking system you proposed. Lunch with Elijah. The prospect sent a flutter through Francis's chest that had nothing to do with professional advancement and everything to do with the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, or how he listened to her ideas with complete attention, as if what she had to say mattered more than anything else in the world. They met at a small cafe a few blocks from the Meridian building, the kind of place where conversation could happen without the constant interruption of office phones and urgent emails. Elijah had chosen a corner table with natural light streaming through large windows, and as Frances approached, she couldn't help noticing how the sunlight highlighted the silver threads that were just beginning to appear in his dark hair. "Thank you for making time," Elijah said, standing as she reached the table. "I know you've been swamped with getting up to speed on everything." "It's my pleasure, and honestly, I love being swamped with meaningful work. It's been a long time since I felt this engaged." Elijah smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face. "I'm glad to hear that. I have to admit, I was a little worried about bringing someone new into such a complex environment, but you've exceeded every expectation." Frances felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I just try to focus on practical solutions." "That's exactly what I mean. Too many people in this industry get caught up in theoretical perfection and lose sight of what actually works in the real world. You have a gift for cutting through complexity and finding the essential elements." As they ordered lunch and fell into conversation about project timelines and coordination strategies, Frances found herself relaxing despite her underlying anxiety. Talking with Elijah felt effortless, like a dance where both partners instinctively knew the steps. He asked thoughtful questions about her process, shared insights about the renewable energy industry, and listened to her responses with the kind of focused attention that made her feel intellectually valued. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elijah said, as their conversation shifted from business to more general topics. Frances tensed slightly, but nodded. "What made you want to work in renewable energy? I mean, your background could translate to almost any industry. What drew you to this specifically?" The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the carefully constructed gaps in her fabricated resume. Frances took a sip of her iced tea, buying herself a moment to formulate an answer that would be honest about her motivations, if not about her background. "I think it started with my father," she said finally. "He was a mechanic, and he used to talk about how technology should serve people, not the other way around. He believed that the best innovations were the ones that made ordinary life better for ordinary families." This was true. Bobby Johnson had indeed held those beliefs, though he'd never worked in renewable energy himself. "When I learned about what Helios was doing," Frances continued, "it felt like exactly the kind of work he would have supported. Technology that could reduce energy costs for families like the one I grew up in. Clean air for children to breathe, jobs that couldn't be shipped overseas because the wind and sun are local resources." Elijah leaned forward, his expression intent. "That's exactly why I started this company. My background is in engineering, but the technical challenges were never the real point. The point was creating a world where sustainable energy is accessible to everyone, not just people wealthy enough to afford the early adoption costs. It must have been a big risk, leaving a traditional energy company to start Helios." "Enormous risk," Elijah admitted. "My ex-wife thought I was having some kind of midlife crisis. She couldn't understand why I'd give up a secure executive position to chase what she called environmental fantasies." Frances felt a sharp pang of sympathy. That must have been difficult. It was. But I realized that security isn't really security if you're not doing work that aligns with your values. I'd rather fail at something meaningful than succeed at something that ultimately makes the world worse. The statement hung in the air between them, and Frances felt its weight settling uncomfortably in her chest. Here was a man who'd risked everything for the sake of authenticity and meaningful work, sitting across from a woman who'd built her relationship with him on a foundation of deception. "I admire that," Frances said quietly. "It takes courage to prioritize meaning over security. Sometimes courage, sometimes desperation," Elijah laughed. "But I've been lucky. The team I've assembled, people like you, have made it possible to build something that's both meaningful and successful." "People like you." Frances smiled, but the phrase echoed in her mind with uncomfortable irony. As lunch wound down and they walked back toward the Meridian building, Frances found herself studying Elijah's profile, the way he moved through the world with quiet confidence, stopping to hold doors for strangers and nodding acknowledgement to street vendors. This was a man who lived his values consistently, who treated everyone with the same fundamental respect. What would he think of her if he knew the truth about her fabricated credentials? "Frances," Elijah said as they reached the building lobby, "I hope this isn't too forward, but would you be interested in having dinner sometime? Not business," he added quickly. "Just dinner." Frances felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with professional advancement and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, as if her answer mattered more than it should for a simple dinner invitation. "I'd like that very much," she heard herself saying. "Saturday night? I know a place that makes the best seafood in the city." Saturday sounds perfect. As they rode the elevator back to the 23rd floor, Frances caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked like a woman who'd just been asked on a date by someone she genuinely cared about. She looked happy, but underneath the happiness, a small voice whispered warnings about the complexity she was creating. Professional deception was one thing. Personal involvement based on that same deception was something else entirely. The elevator doors opened, returning them to the bustling activity of Helios Corporation, where Frances Johnson, Senior Administrative Assistant, had important work to do coordinating renewable energy projects. The question was whether Frances Johnson, the woman, could continue to live with the distance between her professional persona and her authentic self. Especially now that her authentic self was falling for a man who valued honesty above almost everything else. Saturday evening found Frances standing in front of her bedroom mirror for the third time in 20 minutes, second-guessing her choice of dress. The navy blue sheath was professional enough to avoid seeming inappropriate, but feminine enough to acknowledge that this was officially a date. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been on an actual date, as opposed to the casual coffee meetings that had constituted her social life for the past few years. "Mom, you look beautiful," Tyler said from her doorway, his 14-year-old assessment delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that only teenagers could muster. "You think so? Not too formal?" "It's perfect." "And Mom?" Tyler's expression grew more serious. "I'm happy for you. You deserve to have someone nice in your life." The simple statement nearly undid Frances's carefully applied composure. Tyler had been taking care of her emotions for months, watching her struggle with unemployment and financial stress, probably worrying about things no 14-year-old should have to worry about. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything to me." Elijah picked her up at 7 o'clock sharp, appearing at her front door in dark slacks and a button-down shirt that made his eyes look impossibly warm. He carried a small bouquet of white roses, the kind of thoughtful gesture that suggested he'd put real consideration into the evening. "These are lovely," Frances said, accepting the flowers with genuine pleasure. "I wasn't sure what you'd prefer, but roses seemed classic, like courtesy and consideration, and the kind of gentlemanly behavior that Frances had begun to think existed only in old movies." The restaurant was everything Elijah had promised, a small place tucked into a converted Victorian house, with soft lighting and the kind of intimate atmosphere that encouraged genuine conversation. Over appetizers and wine, they talked about everything except work. Frances learned that Elijah had grown up in Oregon, that he'd wanted to be a forest ranger before discovering his gift for engineering, that he read poetry when he couldn't sleep and made pancakes that were apparently legendary among his friends. "What about you?" Elijah asked as their main courses arrived. "What did you want to be when you grew up?" Frances paused, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing too much. "A teacher, actually. I love the idea of helping people understand complex ideas, breaking things down into manageable pieces. That's interesting. In some ways, that's exactly what you do now, isn't it? Helping different departments understand each other's constraints and priorities. I suppose it is, Francis smiled, struck by the observation. I never thought about it that way. Why didn't you pursue teaching? The question touched on territory Francis preferred not to explore in detail. The truth was that her father's death when she was 23 had derailed her plans for finishing college. Between supporting her grieving mother and dealing with her own loss, education had taken a backseat to more immediate survival needs. Then Tyler had arrived, and single motherhood had narrowed her choices even further. Life happened, she said simply. Sometimes the path you end up on isn't the one you planned, but it turns out to be exactly where you needed to be. Elijah nodded with understanding. I think that's true for most of us. I certainly never planned to be running a renewable energy startup at 40 but I can't imagine doing anything else now. As the evening progressed, Francis found herself relaxing into the pleasure of genuine connection. Elijah was funny in unexpected ways, thoughtful without being ponderous, and he listened to her stories with the kind of attention that made her feel genuinely interesting. When she talked about Tyler's academic achievements, Elijah's pride seemed almost parental. When she mentioned her mother's health challenges, his concern felt entirely authentic. You're remarkable, Elijah said as they shared dessert, his tone suddenly more serious. The way you balance everything, your work, your family, your own ambitions, I don't know how you manage it all. Francis felt a familiar flutter of anxiety beneath the warmth of his admiration. I just take it one day at a time. What choice do I have? Most people would have choices, compromise on family responsibilities to focus on career advancement, or scale back professional ambitions to manage personal obligations. But you seem to excel at both. The observation was meant as a compliment, but it highlighted exactly the kind of expectations that her fabricated resume had created. Francis was succeeding professionally, precisely because her real skills were more relevant than she'd initially realized, but Elijah's admiration was based partly on credentials she didn't actually possess. I've been fortunate to find work that suits my natural abilities, she said carefully. It's more than fortune. You have genuine talent for seeing solutions that others miss. Arthur mentioned the other day that your operational insights have been invaluable for streamlining our project coordination. Arthur. The mention of his name sent a small chill through Francis's pleasure in the evening. She'd noticed Arthur watching her more carefully lately, asking questions about her previous experience that seemed designed to test her knowledge rather than simply gather information. Arthur seems very thorough, Francis said diplomatically. He's protective of the company, Elijah replied, sometimes overly so. He's been with Helios since the beginning, and he takes any change in personnel very seriously. Don't take his scrutiny personally, but Francis suspected that Arthur's scrutiny was becoming increasingly personal, though not in any way she could discuss with Elijah without raising uncomfortable questions. As Elijah walked her to her front door at the end of the evening, Francis found herself wishing the night could continue indefinitely. Being with him felt natural in a way she hadn't experienced in years, as if she could be completely herself without editing or performing. Except, of course, she couldn't be completely herself, not without revealing the deception that had made their entire relationship possible. I had a wonderful time, Elijah said, stopping at her front steps and turning to face her directly. So did I. Thank you for a lovely evening. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Francis felt the electricity of possibility crackling in the space between them. Then Elijah stepped closer, his hand reaching up to touch her face gently. May I kiss you? The question, asked with old-fashioned courtesy, nearly melted Francis's resolve entirely. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and felt his lips meet hers in a kiss that was tender, searching, and full of promise. When they separated, Frances felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, not just because of the kiss itself, but because of what it represented. She was falling for this man, genuinely and completely, and he was falling for a version of her that wasn't entirely real. "Good night, Frances," Elijah said softly. "Good night." As she watched him drive away, Frances stood on her front porch, feeling the weight of impossible complications settling over her like a heavy coat. She was succeeding at work through a combination of genuine competence and fabricated credentials. She was falling in love with a man who valued honesty above almost everything else. And she was building a life that felt more authentic and fulfilling than anything she'd experienced in years, all on a foundation of deception. Inside the house, Tyler looked up from his homework as she entered. "How was dinner?" "It was wonderful." "Good. You deserve wonderful." Tyler's matter-of-fact acceptance of her happiness made Frances's chest tighten with emotion. Later, lying in bed and replaying every moment of the evening, Frances tried to imagine a scenario where she could tell Elijah the truth about her fabricated resume without losing everything she'd built. But every possibility she explored led to the same conclusion. Revelation would mean devastation, not just for her, but for Tyler and Dorothy as well. Some secrets, she told herself, were worth keeping. Some lies served a greater truth. But as she drifted towards sleep, Elijah's voice echoed in her memory. "I'd rather fail at something meaningful than succeed at something that ultimately makes the world worse." The question that haunted her dreams was whether building a relationship on deception, no matter how well-intentioned, was making the world better or worse. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected complication. Frances was reviewing weekend project updates when Maya approached her desk with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Frances, you're going to love this," Maya said, settling into the chair beside Frances's workstation. "Mr. Bennett just got off a call with our biggest potential client. They want to schedule a site visit next week to see our operations and meet key personnel." "That's wonderful news," Frances replied, though something in Maya's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Here's the exciting part. They specifically asked to meet with you." Frances felt her coffee cup slip slightly in her hands. "I'm sorry, what?" "Apparently, word has gotten out about your operational innovations. The client mentioned that they'd heard Helios had brought in someone with exceptional systems coordination experience, and they wanted to understand how our internal processes might translate to their implementation needs." Exceptional systems coordination experience. The phrase hit Frances like a small slap, reminding her of exactly how far her professional reputation had traveled beyond her actual qualifications. "Who is the client?" Frances asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Midwest Energy Cooperative. They're considering a massive renewable energy conversion, potentially our largest contract ever. Mr. Bennett thinks your ability to explain complex coordination in practical terms could be crucial for closing the deal." Frances nodded, maintaining an expression of professional confidence while her internal voice screamed warnings. A site visit meant detailed questions about her background, methodology, previous implementations, the kind of scrutiny that her fabricated resume might not survive. "When is the visit scheduled?" "Next Thursday. Mr. Bennett wants to meet with you this afternoon to discuss preparation strategies." As Maya walked away, Frances stared at her computer screen without seeing it, her mind racing through possible scenarios. She could claim to be sick the day of the visit, but that would only delay the inevitable. She could confess her deception to Elijah before the meeting, but that would likely result in immediate termination and the collapse of everything she'd built. Or she could prepare intensively, draw on her real experience, and hope that her genuine competence could carry her through questions about fabricated credentials. "Frances," Arthur Wood's voice interrupted her anxious calculations. He was standing beside her desk with a manila folder and an expression of polite professional interest that somehow felt more dangerous than outright hostility. "Good morning, Arthur. What can I help you with?" "I'm putting together some background information for the Midwest Energy presentation, and I realized I don't have detailed records of your previous implementations. Could you provide some specific case studies from your renewable energy work, client names, project timelines, that sort of thing?" The request was perfectly reasonable for someone with the background Frances had claimed. It was also impossible for her to fulfill honestly. "Of course," Frances said, buying herself time while her mind scrambled for a response. "Most of my previous work involved confidentiality agreements, so I'll need to be careful about client identification, but I can certainly provide anonymized case studies that demonstrate methodology and outcomes." Arthur nodded, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing. "That would be perfect. When do you think you could have something ready?" "End of the week." "Excellent. I appreciate your thoroughness about confidentiality. It's always interesting to learn about different approaches to systems coordination in our industry." As Arthur walked away, Frances felt a bead of sweat form between her shoulder blades, despite the office's comfortable temperature. His request for case studies was either routine due diligence or a deliberate test of her credibility. Either way, she now had less than a week to produce documentation that would support her fabricated background. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, punctuated by moments of escalating anxiety. Frances found herself taking detailed notes on every conversation, every project update, every technical discussion, as if comprehensive knowledge of current operations could somehow compensate for her fictional previous experience. At 2 o'clock, she knocked on Elijah's office door for their meeting about the Midwest Energy presentation. "Frances, come in," Elijah said, looking up from what appeared to be a detailed technical proposal. "I hope Maya filled you in on the basics. This could be a game-changing contract for us." She mentioned the scope. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is, but it's also our biggest test yet. Midwest Energy has been burned by renewable energy promises before. They're going to be looking for evidence that we can deliver not just innovative technology, but reliable implementation and ongoing operational support." Frances settled into the chair across from his desk, trying to project confidence while her stomach churned with nervous energy. "That's where your background becomes crucial," Elijah continued. "They need to see that we understand the practical challenges of large-scale renewable energy coordination, not just the theoretical benefits." "What specific aspects of coordination are they most concerned about?" "Integration with existing grid infrastructure, timeline coordination for multiple site installations, ongoing maintenance protocols, and staff training for long-term operational sustainability." Each item Elijah mentioned was both familiar and terrifying to Frances. Familiar because they were logical extensions of coordination challenges she'd dealt with in smaller contexts. Terrifying because the scale and technical specificity were far beyond anything she'd actually managed. "I'll need to review their current infrastructure specifications," Frances said, falling back on her usual strategy of asking thoughtful questions to mask the gaps in her knowledge. "Absolutely. I'll have Maya send you everything we have. But Frances, I want you to know how much confidence I have in your ability to handle this presentation. Your practical approach to complex coordination is exactly what they need to hear." The trust in Elijah's voice made Frances's chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He believed in her competence because she'd demonstrated real ability to solve coordination problems. But he also believed in credentials that didn't exist, and experience she'd never actually gained. "I appreciate your confidence," Frances said. "I'll do everything I can to prepare thoroughly." "I know you will." "And Frances?" Elijah's tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal. "Saturday night was wonderful. I hope we can do it again soon." Despite everything else weighing on her mind, Frances felt a flutter of warmth at his words. "I'd like that very much." As she left his office with a stack of client specifications and infrastructure reports, Frances realized she was facing the most complex challenge of her professional life. She needed to prepare for a presentation that could make or break Helios Corporation's largest deal, using expertise she'd claimed but didn't fully possess, while managing Arthur's increasingly pointed questions about her background. And underneath it all, she was falling in love with a man who trusted her completely, based partly on a foundation of deception that grew more complicated every day. That evening, Frances spread the Midwest Energy documents across her kitchen table, studying infrastructure specifications and coordination requirements, while Tyler worked on homework at the other end of the table and Dorothy prepared dinner in the background. "Big presentation coming up?" Tyler asked, looking up from his algebra textbook. "Very big. Potentially the most important thing I've ever worked on." "You'll be great, Mom. You always figure out how to make complicated things work." The simple confidence in Tyler's voice nearly brought tears to Frances's eyes. Her son believed in her ability to handle any challenge, just as Elijah did. Just as she'd begun to believe about herself, before the weight of her deception reminded her that confidence built on lies was inherently fragile. "Frances," Dorothy said from the kitchen, her voice carrying the wisdom of 7 decades. "Whatever's troubling you about this presentation, remember that competence can't be faked indefinitely. Either you can do the work or you can't. And from what I've seen, you most certainly can." Her mother's words were meant as encouragement, but they highlighted the central question that Frances could no longer avoid. Was her growing competence at Helios genuine enough to support the fabricated credentials that had made the opportunity possible? She had 4 days to find out. Thursday morning arrived with the relentless punctuality of Judgment Day. Frances stood in the Helios Corporation conference room at 7:30, reviewing her presentation materials one final time while trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The Midwest Energy delegation was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock. 3 executives, 2 engineers, and an operations specialist, all coming to determine whether Helios Corporation had the expertise to handle their massive renewable energy conversion. And all expecting to meet Frances Johnson, the systems coordination expert whose innovative approaches had supposedly transformed multiple large-scale renewable energy implementations. "You look ready," Maya said, entering the conference room with fresh coffee and what Frances had come to recognize as her crisis management smile. "Mr. Bennett is meeting with the advanced team now, and Dr. Chen is setting up the technical demonstration. How are they responding so far?" "Very positively. They're impressed with our facilities and our engineering capabilities. Now they want to understand our operational reliability." Operational reliability, the phrase that would either validate Frances's real competence or expose her fabricated credentials. "Frances," Arthur Wood appeared in the doorway, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional courtesy that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wanted to review the coordination methodology we'll be presenting, just to make sure our messaging is consistent." Over the past week, Arthur's questions about her background had grown more detailed and more pointed. Frances had provided anonymized case studies that drew heavily on her real coordination experience, dressed up with terminology borrowed from renewable energy industry reports. But Arthur's scrutiny suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her carefully constructed responses. "Of course," Frances replied, "I'm planning to focus on integrated timeline management and cross-functional communication protocols." Interesting approach. In your previous renewable energy implementations, how did you handle the coordination between federal regulatory compliance and local infrastructure requirements? The question was specific enough to require detailed knowledge of regulatory frameworks that Frances had only learned about during her crash education over the past month. I found that the key was establishing clear communication channels between all stakeholders early in the process, Francis said carefully. Regulatory compliance becomes much more manageable when it's integrated into timeline planning from the beginning rather than being treated as a separate consideration. Arthur nodded, but his expression remained analytically neutral. And how did you structure the stakeholder communication in your largest implementation? Francis felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but she drew on her real experience managing complex coordination challenges, translating them into the renewable energy context she'd been studying intensively. I used a tiered communication structure, she replied. Daily coordination between operational teams, weekly alignment meetings with department heads, and monthly strategic reviews with executive stakeholders. The key was making sure information flowed both horizontally and vertically, so problems could be identified and addressed before they became crises. Practical approach, Arthur said, though his tone remained non-committal. At exactly 9 o'clock, Elijah entered the conference room with 6 people who represented potentially the most important business meeting in Helios Corporation's history. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Francis Johnson, our Senior Administrative Coordinator, Elijah said, his voice warm with professional pride. Francis has been instrumental in streamlining our internal coordination processes, and I believe her insights into large-scale operational management will be invaluable for your project. Francis stood, extending her hand to each member of the delegation while mentally cataloguing their faces and titles. Robert Henderson, Chief Operations Officer; Dr. Linda Martinez, Lead Engineer; James Thompson, Infrastructure Specialist. Each handshake represented another person who would be evaluating her claimed expertise. Miss Johnson, Robert Henderson said as they settled around the conference table, we've heard impressive things about your systems coordination background. Midwest Energy has had some challenging experiences with renewable energy implementations in the past, primarily around operational coordination failures. I understand completely, Francis replied, drawing on every conversation she'd had with Elijah and Dr. Chen about implementation challenges. Coordination failures are often the hidden obstacle in renewable energy projects. The technology works beautifully, but the human systems that support the technology can be fragile. Dr. Martinez leaned forward with interest. Can you give us a specific example of how you've addressed coordination failures in previous projects? This was the moment Francis had been preparing for and dreading in equal measure. She thought about her real experience managing the chaos when Morrison Industries had been acquired by a larger company, the weeks of confusion and miscommunication that she'd helped resolve through systematic information management. In one of my previous implementations, Francis began, drawing on that real experience while translating it into renewable energy terminology. We were dealing with a timeline crisis where manufacturing delays were cascading into installation scheduling, which was affecting grid integration testing, which was jeopardizing our regulatory approval deadlines. She paused, seeing nods of recognition from the engineers in the room. These were problems they'd clearly encountered before. The issue wasn't any single component failure, Francis continued. It was information lag between departments. Manufacturing knew about delays 3 days before they informed installation scheduling. Installation scheduling adjusted their timelines without updating the grid integration team. Each department was solving problems locally without understanding the systemic impact. How did you resolve it? James Thompson asked. I implemented what I called a coordination cascade protocol. Any timeline change in one department automatically triggered notification to all downstream processes. More importantly, I required each department to identify not just their immediate dependencies, but their secondary dependencies as well. Francis was warming to the subject now. because this was problem-solving territory where her real experience provided solid ground. The result was that instead of having information flow sequentially through departments, we had simultaneous visibility across all interdependent processes. Delays were addressed systemically rather than locally, and we actually finished the project 2 weeks ahead of the revised schedule. The room was quiet for a moment, and Frances felt her heart pounding as she waited for their response. "Elegant solution," Dr. Martinez said finally. "Most coordination approaches focus on hierarchical information flow, but your horizontal visibility model is much more resilient." Relief flooded through Frances as she realized her explanation had not only been accepted, but genuinely appreciated. For the next 2 hours, the discussion ranged across technical specifications, timeline management, stakeholder coordination, and quality assurance protocols. Frances found herself drawing more and more on her real experience, translating the coordination challenges she'd solved in smaller contexts into the renewable energy framework she'd been studying intensively. And remarkably, it worked. Her genuine understanding of how complex systems functioned, combined with her month of immersive learning about renewable energy operations, allowed her to provide insights that were both practical and relevant. "This has been extremely helpful," Robert Henderson said, as the formal presentation concluded. "Ms. Johnson, your operational perspective addresses exactly the concerns we had about implementation reliability. I'm glad I could provide useful insights," Frances replied, feeling a mixture of professional pride and persistent anxiety about the deception that had made the meeting possible. As the delegation prepared to leave for their technical tour with Dr. Chen, Elijah caught Frances's eye across the conference room. His expression was pure professional admiration mixed with personal warmth, and Frances felt her chest tighten with the complexity of emotions that had become her constant companion. She'd succeeded. Her presentation had been genuinely helpful, demonstrating real competence and practical insight. But that success was still built on fabricated credentials and exaggerated experience. "Excellent work," Arthur Wood said quietly as the room emptied, his tone carrying a note of grudging respect that Frances hadn't heard before. "Your coordination methodology was quite impressive." "Thank you. I have to admit, I was initially skeptical about your background," Arthur continued, his voice lowering slightly. "Some of your responses to my questions seemed vague, but your presentation today demonstrated genuine expertise." Frances felt relief and anxiety in equal measure. Had her performance satisfied Arthur's suspicions, or had it simply convinced him to probe more carefully? "I appreciate your feedback," she said diplomatically. As Arthur walked away, Frances remained in the conference room, surrounded by the detritus of her successful deception. Presentation slides, technical specifications, and coordination charts that represented her growing competence built on a foundation of fabricated credentials. She was becoming genuinely skilled at work that she'd claimed to be qualified for. But the gap between her real abilities and her fictional background remained a chasm that could still swallow everything she'd built. The question was whether her growing competence could eventually justify the lie that had made it possible, or whether the truth would eventually demand its own reckoning. The call came at 11:47 on Friday morning, just as Frances was reviewing the final details of the project coordination system she'd been developing, based on the insights from the Midwest Energy presentation. "Frances, can you come to my office?" Elijah's voice carried an undertone of excitement that made her look up from her computer screen with immediate attention. "Of course, I'll be right there." She found Elijah standing beside his desk with his phone still in his hand, his expression combining professional triumph with something that looked remarkably like joy. "We got it," he said simply. "The Midwest Energy contract. The entire thing. 18-month implementation, full renewable conversion for their primary grid infrastructure. The largest contract in Helios Corporation's history. Francis felt a rush of genuine excitement. That's incredible news. Congratulations. Congratulations to all of us, Elijah corrected, but Francis, Robert Henderson specifically mentioned that your operational insights were the deciding factor. He said they'd been burned by companies with strong technology but weak implementation capabilities, and your presentation convinced them that we understood the practical challenges as well as the theoretical possibilities. The praise should have filled Francis with pure professional satisfaction. Instead, it intensified the growing complexity of her emotional situation. She'd contributed genuinely to this success, but that contribution was still entangled with deception about her background. "I'm glad I could help make the difference," Francis said. "It's more than that." Elijah moved closer, his expression shifting from professional excitement to something more personal. "Francis, you've transformed how this company thinks about operational coordination. Your insights haven't just helped us win contracts, they've made us better at what we do." The sincerity in his voice made Francis's chest tighten with a mixture of pride and guilt that had become increasingly familiar. "Working here has been transformative for me too," Francis said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about her experience at Helios. "I hope it continues to be," Elijah said, his tone shifting in a way that made Francis look at him more carefully. "Because I'd like to offer you a promotion." Francis felt the world tilt slightly. "A promotion? Director of Operations Coordination. Your own department, direct report to me. Salary increased to $60,000. You'd be responsible for developing coordination protocols for all our major implementations, starting with Midwest Energy. Director of Operations Coordination." The title represented everything Francis had never dared to hope for professionally. Meaningful work, financial security, genuine responsibility, and recognition for abilities she was only beginning to understand she possessed. It also represented a level of scrutiny and expectation that would make her fabricated background even more precarious. "I'm honored," Francis said carefully. "When would you need a decision?" "Take the weekend to think about it," Elijah replied. "But Francis, I hope you'll say yes. I can't imagine implementing the Midwest project without your leadership." As Francis walked back to her desk, her mind raced with the implications of Elijah's offer. A promotion would mean more money, more security for Tyler and Dorothy, and the opportunity to do work that genuinely excited her. But it would also mean more visibility, more responsibility, and more opportunities for her fabricated credentials to be discovered. "Francis," Maya's voice interrupted her swirling thoughts. "I just heard the news about Midwest Energy. This is incredible. It really is. And Mr. Bennett told me about the promotion offer. Director of Operations Coordination. You must be over the moon." Over the moon. If only it were that simple. That afternoon, Francis found herself staying late at the office, ostensibly reviewing project specifications, but actually trying to process the magnitude of the decision she faced. The building was quiet, most of the staff having left for their weekend plans, but the Helios office space felt peaceful rather than empty. Working late, Francis looked up to find Arthur Wood standing beside her desk, carrying his briefcase and wearing the kind of expression that suggested their encounter wasn't entirely coincidental. "Just reviewing some project details," Francis replied. "I heard about the promotion offer. Congratulations." "Thank you." Arthur settled into the chair beside her desk, his manner casual but his attention focused. "Francis, can I ask you something directly?" Francis felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but nodded. "Your background is unusual. Most people with your level of systems coordination expertise have very specific educational credentials or industry certifications, but your approach to problem solving is remarkably intuitive." almost as if you developed your methodology through practical experience rather than formal training. The observation was both perceptive and dangerous. Arthur had clearly been studying her work closely enough to recognize that her competence was real, but her background was potentially questionable. "I've always been a practical learner," Francis said carefully. "I tend to focus on what works rather than what theory suggests should work." "That's admirable. And effective, obviously, but it does make me curious about your previous implementations. The case studies you provided were quite general. I'd be interested in more specific details about your renewable energy coordination experience." Francis felt the walls of her careful deception closing in slightly. Arthur's questions were becoming more pointed and more difficult to deflect without raising additional suspicions. "As I mentioned, confidentiality agreements limit how specific I can be about client details," Francis replied. "Of course. But perhaps you could describe your educational background in systems coordination, graduate degree, professional certifications, that sort of thing." The question struck directly at the heart of Francis's fabricated resume. Educational credentials were easily verifiable, unlike the general claims about experience that she'd been able to support with anonymized case studies. "I have a somewhat unconventional background," Francis said, which was true in ways Arthur couldn't imagine. "More focused on practical application than formal academic study." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. Well, regardless of your background, your results speak for themselves. The Midwest Energy presentation was quite impressive." As Arthur left for the weekend, Francis remained at her desk feeling the weight of increasingly complex pressures. Her success at Helios was genuine, built on real competence and legitimate insights. But that success was still supported by fabricated credentials that could unravel everything if subjected to detailed scrutiny. The promotion Elijah had offered represented both an incredible opportunity and a dangerous elevation of stakes. More responsibility meant more visibility, more questions, more opportunities for her deception to be discovered. But it also meant the financial security and professional fulfillment she'd been seeking her entire career. As Francis finally gathered her things to leave the office, her phone buzzed with a text from Elijah. "Dinner tomorrow night. I'd love to celebrate the Midwest contract with you, and maybe discuss the future." Discuss the future. The phrase carried both promise and peril, representing the growing personal relationship that was becoming entangled with her professional deception. Francis typed back, "I'd love to. Looking forward to it." As she drove home through the Friday evening traffic, Francis realized she was facing a decision that would determine not just her professional future, but the kind of person she wanted to be. She could accept the promotion, continue building her competence while managing the risks of her fabricated background, and hope that her real abilities would eventually justify the deception that had made them possible. Or she could find a way to be honest about her background, accepting whatever consequences that honesty might bring. The question was whether she had the courage to choose truth over security, especially when that choice would affect not just her own future, but Tyler's and Dorothy's as well. Some decisions, Francis reflected as she pulled into her driveway, were too important to make alone. But this was one secret she couldn't share with anyone, which meant the decision would be hers to make and hers to live with, whatever the consequences might be. Saturday evening found Francis sitting across from Elijah at the same intimate restaurant where they'd had their first date, but everything felt different now. The promotion offer hung between them like a bridge she hadn't yet decided whether to cross, and the success of the Midwest Energy contract had elevated the stakes of every conversation. "You seem thoughtful tonight," Elijah observed as they waited for their appetizers to arrive. "Second thoughts about the promotion?" Francis smiled, appreciating his directness. "Not second thoughts, exactly. More like processing the magnitude of the opportunity." It is a big step, Elijah agreed. But Francis, I want you to know that this offer isn't just about your technical competence, though that's certainly exceptional. It's about your leadership potential. The way you think about complex problems, the way you communicate with different types of people, the way you see solutions that others miss. Each compliment intensified the knot of anxiety in Francis's chest. Elijah's admiration was genuine, based on real abilities she was still discovering she possessed, but it was also based on credentials that existed only on paper. I appreciate your confidence in me, Francis said, and I want you to know that working at Helios has been transformative. I've never felt this engaged with my work before. That shows. Your enthusiasm is infectious. The whole team has responded to your energy and your insights. As their conversation progressed through dinner, Francis found herself studying Elijah's face, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gesture he made with his hands when he was explaining something complex, the tone his voice took when he talked about work that mattered to him. She was falling in love with this man, genuinely and completely, and he was falling in love with a version of her that wasn't entirely honest. "Francis," Elijah said, as their main courses were cleared away, "can I tell you something personal?" She nodded, though her heart rate accelerated slightly. "When I started Helios, I knew I wanted to build something meaningful, clean energy, environmental sustainability, all of that. But what I didn't anticipate was how much I'd want to share that vision with someone. Not just professionally, but personally." Francis felt her breath catch as she began to understand the direction of his words. "Meeting you has changed that," Elijah continued, his voice growing softer. "Not just because you're brilliant at what you do, though you are, but because you understand what it means to build something that matters. You see the bigger picture. Elijah, I'm in love with you, Francis. I know it's only been a few weeks, and I know that mixing personal and professional relationships can be complicated, but I can't pretend that what I feel is just professional admiration." The simple declaration hit Francis like a physical impact. Joy and terror in equal measure, because she loved him too, desperately and completely, and because her love was built on a foundation that could crumble at any moment. "I love you too," she heard herself saying, because the truth of her feelings was the one honest thing she could offer him. Elijah's face lit up with pure happiness. "Really? Really? Completely? More than I thought I could love anyone." They reached for each other simultaneously, hands meeting across the small table, and Francis felt the electricity of connection that had nothing to do with professional advancement and everything to do with genuine emotional intimacy. But underneath the joy, a small voice whispered warnings about the complexity she was creating. Professional deception was one thing. Love based on that same deception was something else entirely. "I want you to know," Elijah said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand, "that regardless of your decision about the promotion, this doesn't change. What's between us is separate from work." Francis nodded, though she knew the truth was far more complicated. Work was where they'd met, where her deception lived, where the fabricated credentials could eventually destroy everything if discovered. "About the promotion," Francis said carefully, "I'd like to accept, but I want to be completely transparent about something." Elijah's expression grew attentive. "My background is somewhat unconventional. I don't have formal academic credentials in systems coordination. Everything I know, I've learned through practical experience and intensive self-education." It wasn't complete honesty, but it was a step toward truth, a way of acknowledging the gaps in her background without fully confessing the fabrication. "Francis," Elijah said gently, "I couldn't care less about formal credentials. What matters is competence, and you've demonstrated that beyond any possible doubt. Some of the most innovative thinkers I know are people who learned by doing rather than by studying theory." His acceptance was both relief and additional burden. He was giving her permission to be honest about her unconventional background, but he was doing so based on the assumption that her experience claims were legitimate. "Thank you," Francis said. "That means everything to me." As they walked to his car after dinner, Elijah's arm around her waist, Francis felt the complexity of her situation settling over her like a weight she couldn't put down. She loved this man, and he loved her. She was genuinely competent at work that engaged all her abilities. She had the opportunity to provide financial security and professional fulfillment beyond anything she'd previously imagined. And all of it was built on a lie that grew more complicated every day. "Francis," Elijah said as they reached her front door, "I know this is moving quickly, but I want you to know that I'm serious about us, about building something real together. Something real." Francis felt the irony of the phrase settling in her chest like a small stone. "I'm serious too," she said, which was entirely true about her feelings, even if the context of those feelings was more complex than he realized. When Elijah kissed her goodnight, Francis felt the same electricity she'd experienced the first time, but now it was layered with deeper emotion and more complicated stakes. She was kissing a man who loved her completely, who trusted her entirely, who had no idea that their entire relationship was built on a foundation that could collapse without warning. Inside the house, Tyler looked up from his homework with a grin that suggested he'd been waiting for her return. "Good evening?" he asked. "Wonderful evening. And the promotion. I'm going to take it." Tyler's face lit up with pure pride. "That's incredible, Mom. Director of Operations Coordination. That's like you're going to be running things. Running things." The phrase carried both excitement and terror, because Francis was beginning to understand that she might actually be capable of running things if she could manage the risks of her fabricated background. Later that night, lying in bed and reviewing the day's emotional revelations, Francis realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She'd accepted a promotion based on fabricated credentials, and she'd entered into a love relationship with a man who trusted her completely. The question now wasn't whether she could continue her deception, but whether she could find a way to transform it into truth before the weight of complexity became too great to sustain. Some bridges, once crossed, could only lead forward. Francis had the weekend to prepare for a future that would require all the competence she could develop, all the courage she could muster, and more honesty than she'd been able to manage so far. The alternative was losing everything she'd built, including the love of a man who saw in her possibilities she was only beginning to believe she might actually possess. But as she drifted towards sleep, one thought echoed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. How long could genuine competence support fabricated credentials before the weight of deception became too great to bear? The answer, Francis suspected, would determine not just her professional future, but the kind of person she would ultimately become. Francis sat in her car in the Helios Corporation parking lot for the last time, her personal belongings in a cardboard box on the passenger seat, her heart still pounding from the devastation of the past hour. Arthur Wood had chosen his moment perfectly. The emergency meeting with Midwest Energy executives to address a critical flaw in the turbine design. The moment when everyone was focused on saving the largest contract in company history. And then, his calm, methodical voice cutting through the technical discussion like a blade. "Before we proceed, I think everyone should know that Miss Johnson's credentials are fabricated. Her resume contains false educational claims, non-existent previous positions, and fictional experience in renewable energy coordination." The silence that had followed was deafening. Francis could still see Elijah's face, the way the color had drained from his features, the way he'd looked at her as if she were a stranger who'd somehow infiltrated his most sacred spaces. She hadn't denied it. What would have been the point? Instead, she'd stood with as much dignity as she could summon and said simply, My credentials were fabricated, but my commitment to this company and this project was never false. The solution to your turbine problem is a simple supplier issue with Henderson Manufacturing. Check the bearing specifications from their March delivery. Then she'd walked out, past Maya's shocked face, past Dr. Chen's disappointed expression, past Arthur's satisfied smile, and directly to the elevator that would carry her away from the life she'd built on a foundation of desperate lies. Now, sitting in the parking lot where she'd first arrived 6 weeks ago with such hope, Frances felt the full weight of what she'd lost. Not just the job, though the financial implications were terrifying. Not just the professional respect she'd earned, though that stung with unexpected sharpness, but Elijah's trust, Elijah's love. The man who'd told her he loved her completely had discovered that the woman he loved had been lying to him from the very first handshake. Her phone buzzed. Tyler texting from school. "How's your big day, Mom? Still saving the planet?" Frances stared at the message, tears blurring her vision. How could she explain to her 14-year-old son that his mother had been fired for lying? How could she face Dorothy, who'd been so proud of her daughter's success? How could she return to their small house and admit that the security they'd all begun to take for granted was built on deception? But as Frances sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of her professional life, something unexpected began to rise in her chest. Not despair, though that was certainly present. Not shame, though she felt that too, but something fiercer, more determined. She thought about the turbine problem that had precipitated this morning's crisis. A manufacturing defect that all of Helios's brilliant engineers had missed, but that she'd identified because her practical experience had taught her to look at problems differently. That insight was real, even if her credentials weren't. She thought about the coordination system she'd developed, the process improvements that had streamlined Helios's operations, the Midwest Energy presentation that had secured their largest contract. Those contributions had been genuine, based on abilities she was only beginning to understand she possessed. Arthur Wood had exposed her lies, but he hadn't negated her competence. Frances started her car and drove home, not as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but as someone who had made a terrible mistake and now needed to figure out how to make it right. She found Dorothy and Tyler in the kitchen, her mother preparing lunch, while her son worked on weekend homework at the table. Both looked up expectantly as she entered, and Frances realized she couldn't hide behind pleasant deceptions anymore. "I was fired today," she said simply. Tyler's pencil stopped moving. Dorothy's hands stilled on the sandwich she was making. "What happened?" Dorothy asked, her voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was prepared to support her daughter, regardless of the answer. Frances sat down at the table across from Tyler, looking directly into his serious dark eyes. "I lied on my resume to get the job. I claimed qualifications I didn't have, experience I'd never gained. Someone discovered the truth and exposed me publicly." The silence that followed was different from the devastating quiet of the conference room. This was the silence of people who loved her processing information that complicated but didn't change their fundamental feelings. "Mom," Tyler said finally, "why didn't you tell me you were struggling that much? I would have understood." The simple question broke something loose in Frances's chest. "Because you're 14, sweetheart. It's not your job to understand your mother's desperation. But it is my job to support you when things get difficult," Tyler replied with a maturity that made Frances's heart ache. "That's what family does." Dorothy moved around the table and placed a gentle hand on Frances's shoulder. "Honey, what you did was wrong. But why you did it, that I understand completely. The question now is what you're going to do about it." "I don't know," Frances admitted. "The job market is still terrible. Without references from Helios, without being able to explain what I've been doing for the past 6 weeks. Frances Marie Johnson, Dorothy said, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades and the wisdom of someone who'd survived genuine hardship. You stop that kind of thinking right now. You didn't get that job because of a piece of paper. You kept that job because you're brilliant at solving problems and coordinating complex systems. That doesn't change because some man decided to embarrass you publicly. But Mama, the company was facing a crisis when I left. A defect in their main product that could cost them everything, and I think I know how to fix it. Dorothy and Tyler exchanged a look that suggested they'd arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. So, fix it? Tyler said simply. Sweetheart, I don't work there anymore. I was fired. I can't just... Mom, Tyler interrupted, his tone taking on the patient inflection of someone explaining something obvious to a slightly slow adult. You said it yourself. They have a problem you can solve. Who cares whether you work there officially? If you can help people, you help people. That's who you are. Frances stared at her son, seeing her father's moral clarity reflected in Tyler's steady gaze. Bobby Johnson would have said exactly the same thing, probably in exactly those words. The man you were falling in love with, Dorothy said quietly. Did your feelings for him change when you learned he'd made mistakes in his past? Frances thought about Elijah's confession about his failed marriage, his admission that he'd nearly given up on his environmental vision during the difficult early years of starting Helios. Her love for him had only deepened with each revelation of his humanity. No, she said slowly. If anything, knowing about his struggles made me love him more. Then maybe you should give him the chance to love your struggles too. That afternoon, Frances spread the Helios technical specifications across her kitchen table one more time, not as an employee trying to protect her deception, but as someone who genuinely understood the problem and wanted to help solve it. The turbine design was elegant, innovative, and fundamentally sound. The manufacturing flaw that was causing performance failures wasn't a design issue at all, but a quality control problem with a specific supplier component. Henderson Manufacturing had changed their bearing specifications in March without informing Helios, probably to reduce costs. The result was a cascade of micro-failures that manifested as major performance problems. It was exactly the kind of coordination breakdown that Frances had spent her career learning to identify and resolve. She picked up her phone and dialed Henderson Manufacturing directly. This is Frances Johnson. I need to speak with your quality control supervisor about the bearing specifications you provided to Helios Corporation in March. 3 hours later, Frances had not only identified the specific problem, but negotiated a solution that would allow Henderson to correct their error without admitting liability, while providing Helios with replacement components at no additional cost. The solution was elegant, practical, and based entirely on her genuine understanding of how complex systems functioned and how people made decisions under pressure. She'd solved Helios Corporation's biggest crisis not because of fabricated credentials, but because of abilities she'd spent 15 years developing and was finally beginning to trust. Now, she just had to find the courage to offer that solution to a man who had every reason never to trust her again. As evening fell, Frances sat on her front porch, watching Tyler shoot baskets in their driveway, his movements unconsciously echoing the fluid grace of his grandfather's mechanical work. Dorothy emerged from the house with 2 cups of tea, settling beside Frances on the old wooden swing that had been Bobby's wedding gift to his bride. You've decided what you're going to do, Dorothy observed, handing Frances her tea. I'm going to save his company, Frances said simply. Not because I expect forgiveness or because I want my job back, but because it's the right thing to do, and because I finally understand that my value doesn't come from a resume. Dorothy smiled, the kind of smile that suggested deep satisfaction with a lesson finally learned. Your father would be proud of you. Even though I lied, especially because you're choosing truth now, when truth is harder than deception. As the sun set over Maple Street, Frances felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete certainty about who she was and what she needed to do. Not Frances Johnson, holder of fabricated credentials, but Frances Johnson, solver of practical problems, protector of people she cared about, and woman finally ready to face the consequences of her choices with dignity and courage. Tomorrow, she would walk back into the Meridian building one last time, not as an employee, but as someone offering a gift with no strings attached. The solution to their problem, and an apology that was finally as genuine as her competence had always been. Whether Elijah Bennett could forgive her remained to be seen. But Frances Johnson had finally forgiven herself, which was the only foundation on which anything real could be built. Frances woke at 5:30 Monday morning, not because of an alarm, but because her body seemed to understand that this was the day everything would be decided. She lay in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood stirring to life, and felt a strange calm settling over her. For 6 weeks, she'd carried the weight of deception like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with each success, each compliment, each moment of Elijah's trusting smile. Now that the worst had happened, now that her lies had been exposed and her professional life had collapsed, Frances discovered something unexpected: relief. The truth was finally out, and she was still here, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of solving problems and caring about people and making a difference in the world. "Mom!" Tyler appeared in her doorway, already dressed for school. "You okay? You're up early?" "I'm going to fix what I broke," Frances said simply. Tyler studied her face with those serious dark eyes that saw everything. "You look different, stronger." "I feel stronger." Strange as that sounds, after everything that's happened, it doesn't sound strange at all. You've been carrying a secret for weeks. Now you don't have to anymore. The observation was so accurate it took Frances's breath away. She'd been so focused on the negative consequences of exposure that she hadn't considered the positive aspects of liberation from deception. "When did you get so wise?" she asked. "I'd learned from watching you handle impossible situations," Tyler replied matter-of-factly. "You never gave up, even when everything seemed hopeless. You just figured out what needed to be done and did it." After Tyler left for school, Frances spent an hour with Dorothy, drinking coffee and discussing practical matters. Financial planning for potentially extended unemployment, contingency plans for healthcare and housing, the kinds of conversations that would have terrified Frances a month ago but now felt manageable. "I'm proud of you, honey," Dorothy said as Frances prepared to leave. "Not for what you accomplished at that job, though that was impressive, but for who you're choosing to be now that the pretending is over." At exactly 9 o'clock, Frances walked through the glass doors of the Meridian building, carrying a leather portfolio that contained her analysis of the turbine problem and a detailed proposal for resolution. She wore her navy blazer and grey slacks, the same outfit she'd worn to her fabricated interview, but this time her confidence was based on truth rather than deception. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt different, not the anxious ascent of someone trying to maintain a false identity, but the determined journey of someone with a specific mission to complete. Maya looked up from her desk as Frances approached, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "Frances, what are you... after Friday, I'm here to see Elijah," Frances said simply. "I have something he needs. I don't think, after what happened, I don't know if he'll..." "Maya, please, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking for." Maya studied Frances's face, perhaps seeing the same change that Tyler had noticed. "Let me check if he's available." Through the glass wall of Elijah's office, Frances could see him bent over what appeared to be technical specifications. his hair disheveled in the way that suggested he'd been running his fingers through it, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the tense concentration of someone facing a crisis. The turbine problem was clearly consuming all his attention, just as she'd expected. Maya returned with a cautious expression. "He'll see you." "But Francis, he's not the same man you knew before." Friday was devastating for him, not just professionally, but personally. Francis nodded, understanding the warning. She'd broken more than just professional trust. She'd shattered the faith of a man who'd opened his heart based on what he'd believed was mutual honesty. "I understand." She knocked on Elijah's office door and entered without waiting for permission, afraid that hesitation might undermine her resolve. He looked up as she entered, and Francis felt her heart contract at the change in his expression. The warmth that had always lit his eyes when he saw her was gone, replaced by a careful neutrality that was somehow more painful than outright anger would have been. "Francis, I'm surprised to see you here." "I have something you need," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk and placing her portfolio on the surface between them. "A solution to your turbine problem." Elijah's expression grew wary. "I think you've provided enough solutions based on fabricated expertise." The words stung, but Francis had expected them. "This has nothing to do with fabricated expertise. It has to do with practical problem-solving and 3 hours on the phone with Henderson Manufacturing." She opened her portfolio and spread out her analysis, watching as Elijah's attention shifted from skepticism to genuine interest despite himself. "The bearing specifications," Francis continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into territory where her competence was unquestioned, "were changed by Henderson in March to reduce manufacturing costs. They didn't inform Helios because they assumed the modifications were within acceptable tolerances. They weren't." Elijah leaned forward, studying the documentation Francis had prepared. "How did you—" "I called them directly, explained the problem, asked the right questions, and negotiated a solution that allows them to correct their error without admitting liability while providing you with replacement components at no charge. You solved our biggest crisis by making phone calls. I solved your crisis by understanding how people make decisions under pressure and how to structure conversations that allow everyone to save face while fixing the actual problem." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, studying both the technical analysis and Francis's face with equal intensity. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you help us after everything that happened on Friday?" Francis met his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she was still discovering she possessed. "Because the work matters. Because your vision of sustainable energy for everyone deserves to succeed. And because—" she paused, taking a breath, "because I owe you the truth about who I really am. I thought I knew who you really were." "You knew more than you realized," Francis said quietly. "The woman who fell in love with your passion for meaningful work, who wanted to be part of building something important, who solved coordination problems through practical thinking and genuine care about outcomes. That woman was completely real. The resume that got her in the door wasn't, but everything else was true." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Francis, what you did, the deception, the lies about your background. How can I ever trust anything you say again?" The question hung between them, and Francis realized this was the moment that would determine whether any kind of future was possible between them. "You can't," she said simply. "Trust isn't something I can argue you into or convince you to give me. It's something I would have to earn back through consistent honesty over time. I'm not asking for that opportunity, because I understand that what I did may have made that impossible." Frances stood, gathering her portfolio. But Elijah, I am asking you to separate what I did from what this company needs right now. Call Henderson Manufacturing. Implement the bearing replacement protocol I've outlined. Save the Midwest Energy contract and the jobs of everyone who works here. She moved toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. I lied about my credentials, but I never lied about my feelings for you or my commitment to this work. And I never lied about believing that you're building something the world desperately needs. As Frances walked toward the elevator, past Maya's concerned expression and Dr. Chen's surprised recognition, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. She'd offered what she could offer, said what needed to be said, and done what was right regardless of the personal consequences. The elevator doors closed on her view of the Helios Corporation offices, and Frances knew she might never see them again. But she also knew that she'd finally acted with the kind of integrity that her father would have recognized, the kind of honesty that could serve as a foundation for whatever came next. Whether Elijah Bennett would choose to build on that foundation remained to be seen, but Frances Johnson had finally given him the chance to make that choice based on truth rather than deception. And sometimes, the opportunity to choose truth was the most valuable gift you could offer someone, even if they might choose to walk away. The call came 3 days later, just as Frances was finishing her morning coffee and steeling herself for another day of job searching in an economy that seemed to have no place for women with complicated employment histories. Frances? Maya's voice carried a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Mr. Bennett would like to see you. This afternoon, if you're available. Frances felt her heart rate accelerate, though she tried to keep her voice steady. Of course. What time? 2 o'clock. And Frances, something's happened. Something good, I think. But it's complicated. Complicated. The word that had defined Frances's entire experience with Helios Corporation from the very beginning. She spent the morning in a state of careful preparation, not wanting to hope for too much, but unable to completely suppress the possibility that Elijah's request meant something positive. She chose her clothes carefully, settling on a simple grey dress that was professional without being presumptuous, and arrived at the Meridian building 10 minutes early. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt familiar and foreign simultaneously, like returning to a place you'd once lived, but no longer belonged. Maya greeted her with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, though tempered by something that looked like caution. He's waiting for you in his office, and Frances, thank you for what you did. The solution worked perfectly. Frances felt a flutter of satisfaction at the news, but kept her expression neutral as she walked toward Elijah's office. Through the glass wall, she could see him standing by his window, looking out at the city skyline with an expression she couldn't read. She knocked and entered, settling into the same chair where she'd made her confession 3 days earlier. "Thank you for coming," Elijah said, turning from the window but remaining standing. "I wanted to update you on the results of your Henderson manufacturing solution." His tone was professional, carefully neutral, offering no hint of personal warmth but also no trace of the anger she'd expected. "The bearing replacement protocol worked exactly as you predicted," Elijah continued. "Henderson corrected their specifications, provided replacement components at no cost, and the turbine performance issues have been completely resolved. The Midwest Energy project is back on track." Frances nodded, feeling genuine relief at the news. "I'm glad it worked out." "It did more than work out. Your solutions saved not just the Midwest contract, but potentially the entire company. If we'd lost that implementation..." Elijah shook his head. "Well, we didn't, thanks to you." Frances waited, sensing that this conversation was building towards something more significant than a simple thank you. "Frances, I've spent the past 3 days thinking about what happened, about the deception, yes, but also about the competence you demonstrated every single day you worked here. About the coordination systems you developed, the problems you solved, the insights you provided that came from genuine understanding of how complex organizations function. Elijah moved to his desk, picking up a folder that Francis recognized as containing her original job application and fabricated resume. "Your credentials were false," he said, holding up the papers. "But your performance was completely real. The question I've been wrestling with is how to reconcile those two facts." Francis felt her throat tighten, but kept her voice steady. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "That I hired the wrong person for the wrong reasons. But that person became exactly the right person for what we actually needed." Elijah set down the folder and looked directly at Francis. "I hired someone with impressive credentials in systems coordination. What I got was someone with practical intelligence, genuine problem-solving ability, and an intuitive understanding of how to make complex operations work efficiently." Francis felt something stirring in her chest, something that might have been hope, but that she was afraid to name. "The credentials were fabricated," Elijah continued, "but the abilities were real. More than real, they were exactly what Helios Corporation needed to grow from a startup with good intentions into a company that can actually deliver on those intentions." "What are you saying?" Elijah sat down across from her, his expression serious but no longer cold. "I'm saying that I want to offer you a position, not the position you originally applied for, which was based on qualifications you didn't possess, but a position based on abilities you've demonstrated and contributions you've already made." Francis felt the world tilt slightly. "What kind of position?" "Director of Practical Operations. A role we're creating specifically for you, based on what you've actually accomplished here rather than what you claimed to have accomplished elsewhere." The title was different from the promotion he'd offered before her world collapsed, but somehow it felt more authentic, more aligned with her actual strengths. The salary would be 55,000 ton, with the understanding that you'd be building a new department from scratch, coordinating between engineering, manufacturing, and implementation, solving the kinds of practical problems that academic training doesn't teach, but that real-world experience does. Francis stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You're offering me a job after everything that happened?" "I'm offering you a job because of everything that happened, because you demonstrated the kind of integrity that chooses to help even when there's no personal benefit. Because you solved our biggest crisis not through academic credentials, but through practical intelligence and genuine care about outcomes." Francis felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but managed to keep her voice steady. "What about Arthur? He was the one who exposed my deception. I can't imagine he'd be comfortable with me returning in any capacity." Elijah's expression grew slightly harder. "Arthur Wood is no longer with Helios Corporation. It turns out that his investigation of your background, while successful, was conducted through methods that violated several privacy policies and employment regulations. More importantly, his decision to expose you publicly during a client meeting, rather than addressing his concerns through appropriate channels, demonstrated a fundamental lack of judgment about what serves the company's best interests." Francis felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Relief that Arthur's opposition was no longer a factor, but also an uncomfortable awareness that her deception had contributed to another person's professional downfall. "I'm not celebrating his termination," Elijah continued, perhaps reading her expression. "Arthur was brilliant with financial analysis and contributed significantly to our early success. But his inability to distinguish between protecting the company and punishing people he disapproved of made him unsuitable for continued employment." "And the rest of the staff? How do they feel about the possibility of my return?" "That's actually the most interesting part," Elijah said, and for the first time since she'd entered his office, Francis saw a hint of his familiar smile. "Dr. Chen and Maya both advocated for offering you a position based on your demonstrated competence. The engineering team specifically requested that whoever replaced you be someone with your practical understanding of coordination challenges. Francis felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Elijah was offering, but underneath the professional opportunity was a more personal question that she needed to address. "What about us?" she asked quietly. "What about what happened between us personally?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his expression becoming more thoughtful and less businesslike. "That's more complicated," he admitted. "What I felt for you was real, but it was also based on incomplete information. I need time to understand who you actually are, as opposed to who I thought you were." Francis nodded, having expected no less. "I understand. But Francis, I want that time. I want the opportunity to know the real you, the person who had the courage to help us even after being publicly humiliated, the person who chose truth when truth was harder than continued deception." Francis felt her heart lift with cautious hope. "So this job offer, it's not contingent on anything personal between us?" "Absolutely not. This is about your professional competence and what this company needs. What might or might not develop between us personally is completely separate." As Francis considered Elijah's offer, she realized that this was the opportunity she'd never dared to hope for, a chance to build a career based on her actual abilities rather than fabricated credentials, a chance to contribute to work that genuinely mattered, and a chance to earn back the trust of a man she'd fallen in love with through honesty rather than deception. "I accept," she said simply. "And Elijah, thank you for seeing past the lies to whatever truth was worth preserving. Thank you for giving me the chance to make that choice," Elijah replied. "When can you start?" Francis smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "How about Monday morning?" As she left the Meridian building that afternoon, Francis realized that she was walking away from her second chance at Helios Corporation, not as someone who'd successfully deceived her way into opportunity, but as someone who'd earned opportunity through demonstrated competence and chosen integrity. The difference felt like the foundation on which a real life could be built. 6 months later, Francis stood in the conference room of Helios Corporation, addressing a room full of renewable energy executives from across the region. But this time, her presentation was based entirely on real experience, documented results, and practical innovations she'd developed through actual work rather than theoretical claims. "The key to successful large-scale renewable energy coordination," Francis was saying, clicking to a slide that showed implementation timelines for 5 major projects, "isn't complex software or sophisticated algorithms. It's understanding how people make decisions under pressure and designing communication systems that support good decision-making even when everything seems to be going wrong." The presentation was going exceptionally well. Francis had developed a reputation throughout the renewable energy industry as someone who could solve the practical implementation problems that often derailed technically sound projects. Her practical operations approach had become a model that other companies were beginning to study and adapt. "Ms. Johnson," one of the executives asked, "your coordination methodology seems remarkably intuitive. What's your educational background in systems management?" 6 months ago, this question would have triggered panic and careful evasion. Now, Francis answered with complete honesty and surprising confidence. "I don't have formal academic training in systems management," she said simply. "My approach is based on 15 years of practical experience solving coordination problems in various industries, combined with intensive self-education in renewable energy technology and operations." The questioner nodded with interest rather than skepticism. "Interesting. Your results suggest that practical experience might be more valuable than academic credentials in this field." "I think both have value," Francis replied diplomatically. "But I've learned that understanding how things actually work in practice is often more important than understanding how they're supposed to work in theory. After the presentation, as executives mingled over coffee and discussed potential collaborations, Frances found herself standing by the conference room windows, looking out at the city skyline and marveling at how dramatically her life had changed. "Impressive presentation," a familiar voice said behind her. Frances turned to find Elijah approaching with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that had grown warmer over the months they'd been working together again, though it remained more cautious than it had been before her deception was revealed. "Thank you. It feels good to talk about work that's based on real experience. It shows. You seem more confident now than you ever did when you were embellishing your background." Frances accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the way Elijah could now refer to her deception directly without the conversation becoming painful or awkward. They'd developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect and honest communication, though the personal dimension remained carefully undefined. "Confidence built on truth is different from confidence built on lies," Frances observed. "Even when the lies are successful, there's always the anxiety of being discovered. And now I know exactly what I can and can't do, what I have and haven't accomplished. It's a much more solid foundation for building anything real." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city bustle below them. Their working relationship had evolved into something more collaborative and equal than the mentor-student dynamic that had characterized Frances's early weeks at Helios. She'd become genuinely indispensable to the company's operations, not because of fabricated credentials, but because of demonstrated ability to solve practical problems that academic training didn't address. "Frances," Elijah said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, though her heart rate increased slightly. "Do you ever regret it? The deception? I mean, if you hadn't fabricated your resume, you never would have gotten the interview, never would have had the opportunity to develop these abilities." Frances considered the question seriously. It was something she'd thought about often during the months of rebuilding her career and her relationship with Elijah on more honest foundations. "I regret the lying," she said finally. "I regret the stress and anxiety it caused, both for me and for everyone who trusted me. But I don't regret the desperation that led to the lying, because that desperation was about protecting my family and creating opportunities for meaningful work." That's a nuanced answer. It's a complicated situation. I made a terrible choice for understandable reasons, and that choice led to both genuine harm and unexpected good. The harm was real, but so were the positive outcomes. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About how sometimes people's worst decisions can reveal their best qualities." Frances felt something shift in the tone of their conversation, a subtle movement toward more personal territory. "What do you mean?" "Your decision to fabricate your resume was dishonest and wrong," Elijah said, his voice growing softer, "but it was also an act of fierce protection of the people you loved. And your decision to help us solve the turbine crisis after you'd been fired and humiliated, that was an act of genuine integrity that had nothing to do with self-interest." Frances felt her breath catch slightly as she began to understand where this conversation might be heading. "Elijah, I've been thinking that maybe the most important thing about a person isn't whether they've ever made terrible choices, but what they do after the consequences of those choices become clear." Frances set down her coffee cup and turned to face him directly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've spent 6 months getting to know the real Frances Johnson, the person underneath the fabricated credentials and the desperate deception. And I like her even more than I liked the person I thought I knew before." Frances felt her eyes fill with tears, though whether they were tears of relief or joy or simple overwhelming emotion, she couldn't say. The real Frances Johnson is someone who protects the people she loves, solves problems through practical intelligence, chooses integrity even when it's costly, and builds things that make the world a little better, Elijah continued. Those are the qualities that matter to me. Even though I lied to you for months, especially because you found the courage to stop lying when stopping required losing everything. Frances felt something inside her chest that had been carefully guarded for months, beginning to open up again. Does this mean... It means I'd like to take you to dinner, Elijah said, smiling with something approaching his old warmth. Not as colleagues celebrating a successful presentation, but as two people who might want to see if they can build something real together, based on complete honesty this time. Frances smiled, feeling lighter than she had since those first weeks of falling in love with the man she'd been deceiving. I'd like that very much. As they walked back toward the Helios offices to conclude the business day, Frances realized that she'd finally achieved something she'd never quite believed was possible. A life built on the foundation of her actual abilities, her genuine character, and her real feelings for work and people that mattered. It had taken a devastating lie and equally devastating consequences to get here, but the woman walking down the street beside Elijah Bennett was finally, completely, authentically herself. And for the first time in her adult life, that felt like exactly enough. 1 year later, Frances stood on the stage of the Riverside Community Center, looking out at an audience that represented everything she'd learned about the difference between credentials and competence, between recognition and respect, between success built on deception and achievement earned through truth. The community center was located in her old neighborhood, the same area where she'd grown up watching her father repair engines and her mother manage household finances with determination and grace. But today, the renovated building hummed with the quiet efficiency of solar panels and wind capture technology, funded by Helios Corporation's community investment program and designed using the practical operations methodology that Frances had developed over months of real-world implementation. 2 years ago, Frances began, her voice carrying easily through the room filled with local families, Helios Corporation employees, and renewable energy professionals from across the state. I was unemployed, desperate, and convinced that my value as a person was determined by what was written on a piece of paper. In the audience, she could see Tyler, now 15 and tall enough to look startlingly like his grandfather, sitting beside Dorothy, whose diabetes was now well controlled thanks to the health insurance that came with Frances's position as Director of Practical Operations. Maya Santos sat with Dr. Chen and several other Helios colleagues who'd become genuine friends rather than simply professional associates. And in the front row, Elijah Bennett listened with the expression of complete attention that had first made Frances feel intellectually valued, back when she'd been trying to hide her authentic self behind fabricated credentials. I thought I needed impressive qualifications to do meaningful work, Frances continued. I thought I needed a college degree to solve problems, or advanced certifications to coordinate complex projects. I was wrong about all of that. The audience was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested her story resonated with their own experiences of feeling undervalued or underqualified in an economy that often seemed to prioritize credentials over competence. What I actually needed was the courage to trust my own abilities, the integrity to be honest about both my strengths and my limitations, and the persistence to keep solving problems even when the solutions weren't immediately recognized or rewarded. Frances paused, making eye contact with faces throughout the audience, seeing her own journey reflected in the expressions of people who'd struggled with similar challenges. The Riverside Community Center represents everything I've learned about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. This building doesn't just use renewable energy technology, It was designed through a process that brought together engineering expertise and community needs, academic knowledge, and real-world experience. She clicked to a slide showing the coordination methodology that had become her signature approach: horizontal information sharing, stakeholder visibility, and decision-making systems designed to support good choices under pressure. The solar installation was completed on schedule, not because we had perfect plans, but because we had communication systems that allowed us to solve problems as they arose. The wind capture system works efficiently, not because the technology is perfect, but because the maintenance protocols were designed by people who understand how equipment actually functions in daily use. Frances smiled, feeling the confidence that came from discussing work she genuinely accomplished through abilities she genuinely developed. Most importantly, this project succeeded because we valued contribution over credentials, results over resumes, and integrity over impressiveness. As she concluded her presentation and moved to the podium for questions, Frances realized that the woman standing on this stage was completely different from the desperate job seeker who'd fabricated a resume 18 months earlier. Not because her circumstances had changed, though they had, but because she'd finally learned to value herself based on her actual contributions rather than external recognition. "Ms. Johnson," an audience member asked, "what advice would you give to someone who feels underqualified for work they're interested in?" Frances considered the question, thinking about her own journey from deception to authenticity. Start by identifying what you actually can do, rather than focusing on what you think you should be able to do. Most valuable skills are developed through experience, not through formal education. And remember that every expert was once a beginner who chose to keep learning. But what about employers who require specific credentials? Some will, and that's their choice. But increasingly, smart employers are learning to recognize competence regardless of how it was acquired. And sometimes, the best opportunities come from demonstrating your abilities rather than just listing your qualifications. After the formal presentation, as people mingled over refreshments and toured the community center facilities, Frances found herself surrounded by conversations about practical problem-solving, community development, and the intersection of environmental technology with social needs. "You look happy," Elijah said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of the excellent coffee that had become a hallmark of community events sponsored by Helios Corporation. "I feel useful," Frances replied. "There's a difference." "I can see that. You seem more centered now than you ever did when you were trying to live up to fabricated credentials." Frances accepted the coffee, noting how natural and unforced their interactions had become over the months of rebuilding their relationship on honest foundations. "Authenticity is less stressful than performance," she observed, "even when authenticity involves admitting limitations or acknowledging mistakes." "Speaking of authenticity," Elijah said, his tone shifting slightly in a way that made Frances look at him more carefully, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Frances felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with slight anxiety. After everything they'd been through, conversations that began with, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss," still made her slightly nervous. "What kind of something?" Elijah glanced around the crowded community center, then nodded toward the exit. "Want to walk outside for a minute? It's a little quieter." They stepped out onto the community center's front porch, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood where Frances had grown up and was now contributing to as an adult professional. "Frances," Elijah began, then stopped, running his fingers through his hair in the gesture she'd learned to recognize as a sign that he was trying to organize thoughts that felt important and complicated. "Just say it," Frances encouraged gently. "We're past the point where honest communication should be difficult." Elijah smiled at her directness. "You're right. Okay, here it is. I want to ask you to marry me. Francis felt the world stop for a moment, not because the proposal was unexpected, their relationship had been moving steadily in that direction, but because of the context in which he was making it. Here? She asked, gesturing toward the community center and the neighborhood that represented both her humble origins and her professional achievement. Here, Elijah confirmed. In the place that represents everything real about who you are and what you've accomplished. Not in some fancy restaurant or romantic getaway, but in the community where you learn to solve problems and care about people and build things that make a difference. Francis felt tears forming in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, rather than the complicated emotional mixture she'd experienced during the months of deception and discovery. The answer is yes, she said simply. But I want you to know that you're proposing to someone whose greatest accomplishment was learning to stop lying about who she was. I'm proposing to someone whose greatest accomplishment was choosing integrity when integrity was costly, Elijah corrected gently. Someone who proved that human worth isn't measured by credentials, but by character. As they kissed on the front porch of the Riverside Community Center, surrounded by the sounds of a neighborhood celebration and the quiet hum of renewable energy technology, Francis realized that she'd finally achieved something she'd never quite understood was possible. A life built entirely on truth. Not perfect truth. She'd made terrible mistakes and would undoubtedly make others. But honest truth. The kind that acknowledged both strengths and limitations, both achievements and failures, both dreams and realities. The kind of truth that could serve as a foundation for building anything real, including a marriage, a career, and a legacy of practical wisdom that had nothing to do with impressive credentials and everything to do with authentic human value. As the sun set over Maple Street, Francis Johnson Bennett, soon to be Francis Johnson Bennett, looked toward a future built on the most solid foundation she'd ever known. The truth about who she actually was, and the love of people who valued that truth more than any fabricated alternative. Sometimes, the most beautiful endings were really just the beginning of something even more authentic and meaningful. And sometimes, the courage to stop pretending was the first step toward discovering who you were actually meant to become. 5 years later, Francis stood in the boardroom of Helios Corporation, but this time she was addressing the board of directors as Chief Operations Officer, a position she'd earned through 5 years of documented results, innovative problem-solving, and leadership that had helped transform Helios from a promising startup into a regional leader in renewable energy implementation. The transformation of both the company and Francis herself was evident in every aspect of the presentation she was delivering. Gone were the days of fabricated credentials and anxious deception, replaced by a confidence born of genuine expertise and authentic achievement. The Community Partnership Program has exceeded all projected outcomes, Francis was saying, clicking through slides that showed renewable energy installations in 12 communities across the state. Not only are we meeting our environmental impact goals, but we're also demonstrating that sustainable energy solutions can be economically viable for communities that traditional energy companies have overlooked. Board members nodded approvingly as Francis detailed coordination methodologies that had become industry standards, cost efficiency improvements that had been adopted by competitors, and community relationships that had become a model for corporate social responsibility. The key to our success, Francis continued, has been our commitment to valuing practical expertise alongside academic credentials, community knowledge alongside technical innovation, and long-term relationship building alongside short-term profit maximization. After the presentation, as board members discussed quarterly projections and strategic planning, Francis found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this position of genuine leadership and authentic influence. Her marriage to Elijah had been built on the solid foundation of complete honesty about both their strengths and their limitations. Tyler, now 20, was studying renewable energy engineering at the State University, inspired by watching his mother develop expertise through practical application and dedicated learning rather than traditional academic pathways. Dorothy, at 77, remained a source of wisdom and encouragement, her health stable and her pride in her daughter's authentic success evident to everyone who knew the family. "Impressive work, as always," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the board chair, as the formal meeting concluded. "Francis, your operational innovations continue to set industry standards. Have you given any thought to our discussion about expanding your role to include strategic planning for our national expansion?" Francis smiled, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from being valued for abilities she'd genuinely developed and contributions she'd actually made. "I'm interested in the opportunity," Francis replied. "But I'd want to maintain our commitment to community-based implementation. National expansion shouldn't mean losing the local relationships that have made our regional success possible." "Agreed completely. That's exactly the kind of perspective we need as we grow." As the boardroom emptied and Francis prepared to return to her office, she caught her reflection in the conference room's large windows. The woman looking back at her was professionally dressed, confidently postured, and completely comfortable with her own competence. But she was also someone who remembered the desperation and deception that had once seemed like her only options. The difference wasn't just in her circumstances, though those had certainly improved dramatically. The difference was in her understanding of her own value, her willingness to be honest about both her achievements and her limitations, and her commitment to building success on foundations that could withstand scrutiny. "Ready to go home?" Elijah's voice came from the doorway, where her husband of 4 years stood, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd been listening to enough of the board meeting to know it had gone well. "More than ready," Francis replied, gathering her materials and moving toward the man who'd learned to love her authentic self more deeply than he'd ever loved the fabricated version he'd first met. As they walked through the Helios offices toward the elevator, Francis noticed the bustling activity of a successful company built on genuine innovation and authentic relationships. Maya Santos, now Director of Client Relations, waved from her office where she was video conferencing with community leaders about a new installation project. Dr. Chen called out congratulations on the board presentation while discussing technical specifications with a team of young engineers who'd been hired based on both their academic credentials and their demonstrated ability to solve practical problems. "How does it feel?" Elijah asked as they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, "to be running operations for a company that's grown from 12 employees to over 200? Francis considered the question, thinking about the contrast between the anxiety-inducing success of her early weeks at Helios and the satisfying achievement of her current role. "It feels sustainable," she said finally. "Success built on truth doesn't require the constant energy that success built on deception demands. I can focus on doing good work instead of maintaining a false identity. And personally, how does it feel to have become exactly the kind of professional you pretended to be when you first walked into this building?" Francis smiled, remembering the desperate woman who'd fabricated credentials because she'd been convinced that her authentic abilities weren't enough to create opportunities for meaningful work. "It feels like proof that people can grow into their potential when they're given chances to demonstrate their actual capabilities rather than just their documented qualifications." As they drove home through neighborhoods that now included several Helios community energy installations, Francis reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had led from desperate deception to authentic leadership. The journey hadn't been straightforward, and it had included moments of devastating consequences that she wouldn't wish on anyone. But it had also proven something she'd never quite believed during those months of unemployment and financial stress. that human value wasn't determined by external recognition or impressive credentials, but by the willingness to contribute genuinely to work that mattered and relationships that were built on truth. At home, Tyler was in the kitchen preparing dinner with Dorothy, both of them animated by a discussion about his senior engineering project, which involved designing renewable energy solutions for rural communities that lacked access to traditional power infrastructure. "Mom!" Tyler called as Francis and Elijah entered through the garage. "Grandma Dorothy was just telling me about Dad's old mechanical engineering notebooks. I want to incorporate some of his practical problem-solving approaches into my academic project." Francis felt a familiar warmth at the way Tyler could now seamlessly blend references to his grandfather Bobby, his father figure Elijah, and his own emerging professional identity. The family that had once been held together by desperate financial strategies was now sustained by genuine love, mutual respect, and the security that came from authentic achievement. "Your grandfather would be proud to see his practical wisdom being applied to environmental technology," Francis said, hugging both Tyler and Dorothy. He always believed that the best solutions came from understanding how things actually work, rather than just how they're supposed to work. Kind of like how you learn to be amazing at your job by actually doing it, rather than just studying theories about it, Tyler asked, with the directness that Francis had come to appreciate as one of his most valuable qualities. Exactly like that. As they sat down to dinner together, Francis looked around the table at the people who represented everything real and valuable in her life. Tyler, whose intelligence and integrity reminded her daily that authentic success was worth pursuing. Dorothy, whose wisdom and resilience had provided the foundation for everything Francis had been able to accomplish. Elijah, whose love had proven that relationships built on truth were stronger and more satisfying than anything constructed on deception. "I have an announcement," Francis said as they finished their meal. "The board approved the national expansion proposal, and they've asked me to lead the strategic development process." "That's incredible, Mom," Tyler said with genuine pride. "You're going to be designing renewable energy policy for the entire country. I'm going to be helping design implementation strategies that prioritize community needs alongside technical innovation," Francis corrected, "making sure that national expansion doesn't lose sight of the local relationships that make this work meaningful. Following the same principles that made our regional program successful," Elijah added approvingly. Practical wisdom scaled up to serve more people. As the evening concluded and Frances prepared for bed, she took a moment to stand in her bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood where she'd once faced eviction notices and impossible financial choices. The same streets were now illuminated partly by solar streetlights installed through one of Helios's community partnership programs, a visible reminder of how individual transformation could contribute to broader positive change. Frances Johnson Bennett had become exactly the kind of professional she'd once thought she needed to pretend to be, but she'd gotten there through a path she never could have imagined during those desperate months of unemployment and deception. The journey had required facing devastating consequences, choosing integrity over self-protection, and learning to value authentic contribution over impressive recognition. But most importantly, it had required the courage to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't and start becoming who she actually was. A practical problem solver, a community builder, a person whose value came from her contributions rather than her credentials, and a woman whose greatest qualification was simply her willingness to keep learning, growing, and serving others with honesty and dedication. As she drifted towards sleep beside the man who'd learned to love her authentic self more deeply than any fabricated alternative, Frances felt the deep contentment that came from living a life built entirely on truth. Not perfect truth, because growth and change were ongoing processes, but honest truth that acknowledged both achievements and limitations, both strengths and areas for continued development. It had taken a devastating lie to teach her the value of radical honesty, but that education had proven to be worth every difficult lesson along the way. Sometimes, Frances reflected as sleep approached, the most important qualification anyone could possess was simply the courage to be authentically, imperfectly, genuinely human. Everything else could be learned, developed, and earned through dedication and honest effort. But authenticity, that was the foundation on which everything real and lasting could be built. And in the end, building something real was all that truly mattered. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.